Morning, everybody. Welcome back to day 3 of the Pokeno rezoning hearings. Just before we start today, the panel, during the course of yesterday afternoon when we finished, and again overnight, have just looked at the schedule for today. And by our reckoning, if everybody that's scheduled to, or everyone that's provided evidence and or submissions wishes to speak or is proposing to speak, we've got 23 individuals to hear from today, and we're pretty confident that we're not going to get through that in the course of a day. We don't want to unnecessarily rush anybody, but our schedule today means that we don't believe that we're going to finish the Havelock Village case today, and rather than rush things, we need to find an alternative date to complete things. And I'd rather do that at the start today before we get going than try and rummage around at the end trying to find another date. So the date that the panel wonders, if and it's particularly Havelock Village, because it looks like they'll be the ones that may well run out of time today, is the afternoon of June the 24th, which is next Thursday, which happens to be, we've got a hearing in the morning on future urban and residential medium density zones, which is somewhat opposite to this anyway. So where's Ms. Evatt? Is Ms. Evatt there?
Yes.
How are your team placed on the afternoon of the 24th of June?
I will have to talk to the team, sir. I don't have that information at my fingertips.
Okay.
I'm getting some indications from the room around me that that is going to cause some complications, but I will have to talk to them and come back to you.
All right. The other thing is the one of us, and it happens to be me, has got a flight that I need to catch early evening today for an Environment Court hearing tomorrow. So we're going to have to finish a little bit before 4 o'clock today anyway, unfortunately, and that's been dumped on me by the schedule of the court. I was expecting to be on Friday, but I'm now tomorrow. So there's not much I can do about that either. So apologies to everybody for any inconvenience. But perhaps if particularly you, Ms. Evatt, if you could liaise with your team over during the course of the morning or the morning break, other dates that are potentially available are 1, 2, 7 or 8 July.
Thank you.
So it's the afternoon of the 24th of June and then 1, 2, 7, 8 July.
Thank you. Well,
and apologies for the inconvenience, but just we just think that, you know, we need to give folk the opportunity to do justice to what they want to tell us, and we're sort of at the pointy end of this topic. And whilst, you know, it would be tempting from our point of view to, you know, to push things through and conclude, we don't think that's fair, and we really need to plan for a bit more time than we've actually been allocated for today. So apologies for that, but that's how we'll rock. So without further ado, Ms. Simons for Pokeno Village Holdings, please.
Mr. Chair, before we do start, I think we should emphasise that we have read all the material there. So
yes, I remind folk of that every time we have one of these hearings, but it is worth pointing out that we have read the material. So we really are looking, notwithstanding what I said before, we still are looking for highlights packages, not trawling through in great detail screeds of information we've already read. So, Ms. Simons, thank you. We can't hear you, Ms. Simons. We can see you. We know your microphone's on, but we can't hear you. Still can't hear you. You're on mute now. We definitely can't hear you now. No, we're not good at lip reading.
Ms. Simons, if I may suggest, connect through your phone if that's at all possible.
Maybe log off and log back in again and see if that fixes things.
You want to send her a note, Fletcher, and just say we can see, but we can't hear.
I think she could hear us okay. I got the sense. You're on mute, Miss Simons. Definitely we won't be able to hear you at the moment because you're muted.
Yeah. Yeah. Just to say, sir, that while Ms. Simons is having these technical difficulties, the Pokeno Village Holdings team is available to appear on the 24th, if that would be a solution.
Well, I think it's probably not so much for the Pokeno Village team and that they're going now. But let's see what happens when Ms. Simons sorts out the technology. For some reason, can you hear us, Ms. Simons? Can you just give it? We can see you, but we can't hear you, and it's showing up on our screen that your sound is muted.
Miss Simons, you don't happen to have headphones plugged into your laptop by any chance at all? Because if you do, okay, all right.
Mr. Chair, one option is to bring Havelock Village up the queue, and then Pokeno can follow after that at the end. I'm not sure how that fits in.
The only thing with that is that there's about 14 witnesses for Havelock Village, and it's going to make it all. The other option might be are the Yashili representatives here? They're supposed to be, but they may not be. So that's not an option either. Well, this is the first time this has happened in about 20-something hearings we've done by Zoom, so pretty confident that the problem's not at our end.
Is Miss Simons on Waiheke Island, is she?
Looks like she's in the Barry Simons boardroom. I can see the logo in the background.
Oh, okay.
She's not muted anymore, but we still can't hear her. Connecting to audio. Hold on, that's looking possibly promising.
So Ms. Simons is stuck in Melbourne, which could be.
Oh, is she in Melbourne?
She is. She's been unable to return because of the closure of the bubble.
Okay. I'm wondering whether a way forward that we could perhaps suggest. Obviously, there's something happening between Melbourne and Auckland or wherever. What do we think about the prospect of Ms. Simons doing her submissions later in the case, perhaps at the end of the witnesses and running with the witnesses first, we have read those submissions, so we understand the context and everything else. I'm just not really that excited for us to sit here, you know, all morning waiting for a link to come through. Ms. Simons, can you, by hand gesture or some other, can you hear us now at all? Who's in the Pokeno Village team there that can make a decision on this? Because that's what we'd like to do, I think, is start with hearing from the witnesses, and Ms. Simons can speak to her submissions later in the piece.
Yeah, that's fine with us. Although, as we say, we're available to present the whole case on the 24th if that was another option.
Well, it doesn't look like we've got the Yashili people here, and we have the way that things are organised at it. Well, maybe we could do that. Ms. Evatt, are you ready to start now?
No, sir, we don't have all our witnesses here. We weren't anticipating starting now.
All right, well, let's just start with Pokeno Village Holdings
Yeah.
witnesses, and we'll make a start on that basis. And maybe the broadband connection in the quarantine hotels in Melbourne's poor, I'm not sure, but that's not really our issue. Well, you guys will have to figure that out, how to join Ms. Simons up. But let's start, and we'll pass it over to the Pokeno Village Holdings team, please.
Thank you, sir. So our first witness today is Colin Wattiker of Pokeno Village Holdings, and we also have Kerry Dines in the room, who's able to provide any additional input as required.
All right, and we just would remind people that we have read the evidence, we've seen the highlights packages, so we're really looking for summaries and cutting to the chase, as opposed to reading chunks of what we've already seen.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Can. Oh, look, I'm really sorry about this. It's never happened before, but it would happen today. Obviously, I'm not in the room with the rest of the team, and I have taken on board your waste any time. I have got some matters that I want to raise. Fraser Colgrave is unavailable today. He has a health issue, so he unfortunately won't be available to answer any questions.
Sorry, who was that? Sorry, Ms. Simons, you cut out right at the point that you're saying someone was unavailable today?
Fraser Colgrave, sir.
Oh, okay, thank you.
All right. So I think rather than take you through the submissions which you've read, I just want to give you some context around why these submissions have been made by Pokeno Village Holdings. The first point is that PVHL is not opposed to growth. It is not opposed to growth. It's probably useful for you to understand the difference between the kind of developers. There's two kinds of developers. Essentially, you have the landowners and the farmers who are looking forward to benefiting reasonably from the rezoning of their land, which will obviously provide some important gains for them. And then there are the developers such as PVHL, which comprises essentially Dines Contracting or Dines Group on the one hand, and Fulton Hogan Land Development. Now, between them, they have been involved in the development of land for the purposes of housing in Auckland for decades, and between them probably Milldale and Millwater, for instance, comprise over 6,000 new houses that have been provided. So the first thing to know is that they do not build houses, they provide land. And as such, they understand the issues around developing land in terms of the rollout of infrastructure, what kind of land responds to easy development, and what kind of land is constrained by issues in terms of terrain, the rollout of infrastructure, water, stormwater, and roading. So when the proposed plan was notified and Pokeno West was identified as being live zoned for development, PVHL was reasonably quite alarmed at the fact of the two factors. Firstly, one is that there appeared to have been an absence of any comprehensive spatial planning and little understanding of how infrastructure was going to be rolled out and funded on that particular land. And that land, of course, was already the subject of investigation and had been rejected by PVHL as being unsuitable for residential development primarily because of the physical constraints in rolling it out in a way that would be feasible. So their opposition was to the apparent absence of any appropriate spatial planning, which of course is fundamental to successful urban development. And this is a plan, it should be a plan, and to leave the planning to be undertaken essentially at the resource consent stage is inappropriate. So the other submitters that you've heard from are essentially landowners who are looking to upzone their land, and they are looking at it from the perspective of 3 points of view, or 3 positions, if you like. The first is that the National Policy Statement for Urban Development requires urgent zoning for more housing. They are prepared to indicate to the panel that they will manage the internal rollout of infrastructure, most primarily stormwater and roading, and that can be managed internally or through or relying on the council to roll it out. And that spatial planning really can be abandoned in terms of the comprehensive viewpoint of Pokeno as a whole, and either have spatial planning within the internal workings of their boundaries or leave it to the resource consenting stage. And in that context, that is the concerns that PVHL have, that there is basically a gold rush where all land that is currently zoned rural can justifiably be live zoned without any kind of interrogation into the means by which it can provide the housing on a feasible and in a way that's actually going to enable the settlement of Pokeno to maintain its character and to be able to be a settlement that will be of value to residents in coming generations. In 100 years, you don't want to have just a landscape covered in cheap housing. So while we need houses, we need to make sure that the character of Pokeno has some continuity and is available for future generations. So it's inappropriate in our submission to forego master planning in favour of just leaving it to the resource consent, because the resource consent process is not a planning process. It's finding an exception to the plan, basically seeking consent. And I think it was, I can't remember Council for Z Energy, what her name was, but she said the other day, we need guidance around how change occurs, otherwise good urban design outcomes are unachievable. And I support that observation. Now, another thing is that PVHL has been accused of monopolistic behaviour, of being spoilers and naysayers. But to be clear, PVHL only has involvement in Pokeno for maybe 2 years. So that's not even a medium term. That's a short-term involvement. There is capacity for another 1,500 houses in the existing Pokeno, and only 50% of that is owned by PVHL. Other private land developers hold the balance. And it should be remembered that PVHL don't sell houses. They sell land, as I said, and they sell 70% of the land to builders. And there are 30 builders currently operating in Pokeno. So you can see that they don't determine the price of houses, as Mr. Fuller was suggesting to you yesterday. they're actually only interested in making sure that there is land available for either builders or individuals who want to build their own home, which apparently is around about 30% of the sales. And there are other significant developers selling land in Pokeno as well. They are not the sole developer of land. There are other companies such as Ko-Fi Homes, Pokeno Homes, and Robbie's. So the monopolistic view and the lack of competition is just not a real argument. Now, those submissions by Mr. Fuller and the evidence of Adam Thompson created quite a lot of concern. And while it is Colin Boddicker from Pokeno who's giving evidence before you, Kerry Dines himself is going to be available to answer any questions that you might have in relation to that issue of the role of the comprehensive developer, such as PVHL, who obviously have an interest in making sure that any development upstream at Pokeno West, etc., Top End, any of those properties that are essentially uphill from the existing community are not going to have downstream effects. You've heard from the Hines Group who say, well, we already have experienced at least 2 floods since they started operating. So there are issues in relation to stormwater which cannot be just put aside and said, well, look, we'll attenuate to 100%. But that's fine if that's the only development being rolled out. But it's quite possible that if you zone large tranches of land, that there's going to be the cumulative effect of other developments in the future that together with Pokeno West are going to create critical issues. If all of the land that is seeking rezoning is rezoned live zoning, the council has to be able to rest assured that there is going to be the transportation infrastructure and the 3 waters infrastructure available to go almost promptly, because we saw what happened when the Hasher legislation rolled out, where Watercare and Auckland Transport said, yes, we can do it. And then we got to the situation where they said, well, after the consent had been granted through the fast track legislation, we had issues that were absolutely catastrophic for a lot of developers, because Watercare and Auckland Transport said, well, yes, we can do it. We didn't say that we could do it straight away. And if you have live zoning, the landowners legitimately have the expectation that the council will, or the agencies will actually be able to service that land immediately. That's the theory with live zoning. So there is obviously going to be a lag of 1 or 2 years for some people, like Pokeno West indicated they couldn't, and Pokeno East also said that they weren't ready to go straight away. But if they are all going to go ahead in 2 or 3 years, then there needs to be that infrastructure available to service that land. So I think one of the things that Pokeno Village Holdings Limited is very happy with is the process by which it has now become possible for land to be zoned for future urban development, future urban zones. So that's one of the reasons why Pokeno has been able to adjust its thinking. And taking a snapshot of where we are now should mean that we should be able to provide, if we have the Pokeno land involved with Plan Change 24, Plan Change 21, and then of course you've got Plan Change 14. And if you were to add some of the land, and Colin Boddicker will take you through this, that is in Pokeno West, you have enough live zoned land that will enable housing to be rolled out at the rate of around 170 houses a year for the next 15 years. The ability to put that land in the forefront and then enable lands like Top and CSL to be future urban, that enables all of the vexing issues that Top End and CSL have in relation to, they've got wetlands, they've got steep terrain, they have a lot of issues in relation to servicing, that can be future urban zoned, and that will enable that land to be rolled out immediately in the medium term, which will provide an integrated and a rollout that will be on a sequential basis rather than a mass gold rush at the beginning of the process. So the NPSUD does have a strong imperative for housing, but it's not at the expense of amenity, although obviously it says amenity can't be a showstopper. But it doesn't say that you are to eliminate any consideration of amenity. It talks about well-functioning communities, and that has to include such things as amenity, which I think brings us into the issue of the RL 100. The first point I want to make is that I was concerned to hear from the landowners who have submitted before, and in terms of the submissions from HVL, that there has been almost zero consideration of iwi concerns. The original structure plan for Pokeno had a very strong response to the clear indication from iwi that the development on the ridgelines was completely unacceptable and inappropriate, that the ridgelines were sacrosanct. That seems to be ignored by all, and I felt that I thought it was appalling in this day and age. You had people like Carl Flavel saying that he felt that he had been conned. That shouldn't have to be expressed. The need to make sure that community of Pokeno settled in the bowl is at least to some extent maintained by the RL 100, I think is actually something that can be done without any kind of detrimental effect on your need to roll out appropriate land for development. You will hear from Colin Botica that there are reasons why it will be good for part of Pokeno West to roll out, and Pokeno East and other land. But at the end of the day, there is absolutely no appropriate basis for Havelock Village Limited to be live zoned or even future zoned. It's a big lump of basalt. I can't imagine how that's going to enable the earthworks for that alone is going to be an issue. But more importantly, as you heard from Heinz the other day, you have an abundance of land that is suitable for development. There are a Pandora's box of issues around Havelock Village. This is a rural village, and you have known adverse effects that will arise if that development goes ahead. Why on earth would you zone land next to heavy industry that requires special acoustic glazing and ventilation when there is to address known effects at the outset? The case law that Mr. Loughton referred you to, I think, is quite clear that it would be the Environment Court's position, if that land were to be zoned, that it was a completely unsustainable planning decision. And there have been a number of planners who have already expressed that concern. It's not enough to say the NPSUD opens doors. It doesn't open doors to allow wholesale rezoning of land without identifying whether it is the best land available for that. And in my submission, there is land all over the Pokeno Valley and beyond, which would be far superior to the Havelock land. I just wanted to make a couple of comments about Mr. Mead's submissions on his 42A report the other day. The first thing is that he said that the the structure plan for Pokeno had run its course. Well, that's not true. There's still over 1,100 sections available for a development there. And he also said that while structure planning was a good idea, it seemed to me he was saying structure planning is a good idea, but we'll do it next time, and this time we'll just do some ad hoc planning at the consenting stage. He mentioned things such as that precinct plans linked to subdivision consent would enable the integration of issues such as transport and stormwater and other issues. But I just don't see how that is even a feasible proposition. I've never encountered a precinct plan being linked to a subdivision consent. I think it's quite a sort of, shall we say, novel and unique concept. And I don't think it has legs. And I felt that there was a preponderance of Mr. Mead's justification for rezoning land based on the fact that there was what he called there was an urban pattern that had emerged from the information that had been made available. But there, and you will hear this from Mr. Bottica, there's land such as those on the plan, that's 9, 10 and 11 to the southwest. None of those landowners have actually put to you a case, but it's not just for the landowners to come to you with a case, it's for the council to go, what is the best land available for urban development? And it might be that 9, 10 and 11 are far superior to Havelock. Well, obviously Havelock they are, but it might be superior to, say, other land which the owners have come to you requesting rezoning. And Mr. Mead seems to be taking the position it's those people who basically it's a squeaky wheel process. Those people that have come to you and said, look, we'd like to develop our land, he's given the nod to, and those that haven't, he hasn't even investigated. And the problem might actually not be with Mr. Mead, but with the background processes undertaken by the council itself. Now, I'm not going to take you through all of the case law that Mr. Fuller criticised yesterday, but I will say, with the greatest respect, that he effectively fudged the meaning of those cases. What I will say is that all of those cases basically take the premise that if it is open for a council to refuse a plan change, and that means a submission on a plan review as well, if it is going to cause unnecessary expense to the ratepayers. In other words, if you cannot service it or it cannot be serviced with sufficient certainty, then you are within your rights to say that that land should not be rezoned for residential development. So those cases are fully supportive of that proposition, and I would dispute Mr. Fuller's interpretation of those cases. And as far as the stormwater attenuation devices are concerned, there are a number of developers who say that they will have attenuation ponds that will enable them to provide 100% attenuation or 80%. There is anecdotal evidence that much of this land, because it is so steep, is going to require at least 70% attenuation, and that comes from council officers. Now, if that is the case, if you go, for instance, from a pond which is doing 100% attenuation to a pond that is 80%, that is a doubling of the size of the pond. Now, if you're going to 70, then you're obviously going to have an even larger system or network of ponding required, which obviously is going to have some impact on the amount of land available for development. So that issue of attenuation needs to be certain, because collectively there is, as I said before, real issues around stormwater in Pokeno already, and upstream properties are going to contribute to an already extant issue. So I think it's probably appropriate now that you hear from Mr. Boddicker, and if necessary from Kerry Dines, on the issue of what is required to enable land to be developed, and why certain parts of the proposed development are more suitable, or the proposed rezoning land is more suitable than others. So I'll hand it over now, and I apologise again for the technical difficulty with my sound system. It would have to happen today, wouldn't it?
That's right. Let's just, thank you. Before you do that, let's just see if the panel have any questions. Ms. Gibb?
Yes, of course.
No questions. Thank you, Ms. Simons.
Mr. Fulton?
Yeah, I have no questions. Thank you.
Ms. Sedgwick?
No questions. Thank you very much.
Ms. Tiaho?
No, thanks.
Mr. Cooney?
Just a couple. You're saying that the NPSUD, although it does provide for a lowering of amenity values, it doesn't extend that far to override issues like reverse sensitivity, etc. That's really what you're saying, isn't it?
Oh yeah, that's exactly what I'm saying. I mean, if you look at the NPSUD, what they're looking at is the sort of the Epsom situation where the neighbours have all got bungalows and suddenly someone's putting up a 6-storey development. That's what they think they had in mind. And I agree with you. You can't just say, well, let's just ignore adverse effects. I mean, that's undermining the Resource Management Act, and the Act obviously prevails over the NPS. Yeah,
just to summarise your client's position, you've got you've got the principal developer of Pokeno. They, with Hines, they've been instrumental in providing for the rezoning and also the provision of infrastructure that is currently serving that area. And what your client is saying, well, if you want to extend development here, you've got to come up with a new structure plan that covers the whole area. Mr. Mead says to us, well, the current structure plan is out of date. We've got demand, obviously, in this area for housing. That's what he says. And the issue of providing for a structure plan can be dealt with through the consenting process. I just gather that he might be saying, and we'll ask David, Mr. Mead, this, it may not be ideal, but if you've got subdivision criteria that requires an integration of infrastructure in terms of the surrounding area, then that would be sufficient to provide for the orderly planning of the future development of Pokeno. So that, what do you say about those sort of competing arguments that you're putting up?
Well, the consenting process, as I said before, is not a planning process. It's basically asking for consent to do something that isn't a permitted activity. That's the first thing. It doesn't give the council an opportunity to look at alternatives, and it certainly, because it's a consent, not a plan change, doesn't give the council the opportunity to direct or guide development in terms of where is the new school going to go, how much roading are we going to be required to link all of these properties together so that there is an overarching umbrella of understanding how much is going to have to be spent on infrastructure, on roading, and how much of that is going to be, how that will be rolled out in order that all of these developments hold hands, as it were. The consenting process does not enable anything other than a yes/no, and it doesn't actually provide for you can have your criteria in terms of a number of matters, but the overriding linking of all of these issues together to show where the business zoned land is going to go is necessary, rather than just having, as Mr. Mead says, let's just zone everything residential and deal with planning later down the track.
Yeah, okay. Thanks for that, thank you.
Thanks, and I have no questions, thank you.
All right, well, I'll leave it now for Mr. Boddicker to take you through his evidence, and as you can see, Mr. Dines is available beside him.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sue, and thanks to the commissioners for the opportunity to speak. In Mr. Mead's opening address, he stated that the old structure plan area is fully developed. This is a major misconception shared by many in this district plan review process. The old structure plan area is 57% complete. That equates to a spare capacity of 1,150 dwellings. We appreciate that you commissioners are under pressure from both central and local government to provide housing at haste. However, you do have the time and mechanisms to ensure sound planning practices occur. As an example, the sound planning practice for the provision of social infrastructure. Schooling as an example. I was speaking to Blair Johnston last night, the Pokeno school headmaster. He was telling me that the school roll is currently 443 children. By the end of the year, 500. The school maxes out at 600, and there are already 7 prefabs on the old rugby field. When the old structure plan area is fully developed, there is a need for a new primary school. And soon after, a secondary school, as Tukau College, Puki High, Rosehill are also maxing out. Through the district plan review process, no schools in Pokeno have been planned for. Where in Pokeno should a new school or new schools be located? Blair Johnson tells me that no one from any of the submitters or council or even the Ministry of Education has spoken to him about the growth that is being proposed. Where are the kids going to go for school? And this is just one example. Another major misconception is that we have monopoly power. As Sue said, we are a land developer. We do not build houses. We do not price land and house packages. We sell to 30 different builders. The big guys, GJ's and Signature, small guys, Summit and DW, smaller guys, even a set of Asian builders we sell to, plus the 25% to 30% we sell to mums and dads direct. Secondly, of the 1,150 dwellings to go, 50% will be built on our land and 50% will be built on others. Who are the others? Sue touched on it, but the McRobbie brothers are the biggest, with approximately 180 to 200 lots. Hughes Group, which is Kofi Downs, Pokeno East, they've already developed about 100. They've got a few to go there. Horizon Resources, 40 lots. Pokeno Heights, 40 lots. The David Laurie land in Pokeno East, 83 lots. Plus, we compete directly with other projects just over the Bombay Hills. Jury Crossing in Ramarama, got to be about approximately 1,000 lots. Charles Marr in Jury, 1,000 lots. Hugh Green Group in Drury, 1,000 lots. Pirata Rise, 3,000 lots. However, the last 12 months has seen an extraordinary market. There's been a frenzy of demand, strangely created mostly by the Reserve Bank's response to COVID. Interest rates, the lowest in recorded history. Money printing like never before. there has been a massive economic sugar rush, which is not sustainable. But if you commissioners feel compelled to zone many, many hectares in Pokeno residential, here is our view of the merits of other submitters' land. Subject to stormwater and the stormwater attenuation, subject to that, Pokeno West Area 1, we believe has the least cultural, environmental, social and economic constraints. Pokeno West Area 1 provides for an additional 665 capacity. Yeah, we're just going to put up the plan now, sorry.
Is Area 1 on Mr. Mead's map, Area 20?
No.
Is that?
I think Mr. Bottic is referring to Area 20.
Yes.
No, I'm referring to Area 1. It's part of Area 20.
Okay.
Well,
Only part of. What we've done is we've done a.
Well, let's put the plan up, Mr. Bottic, because there's some confusion around this. Area 1 on Mr. Mead's map is in Pokeno East.
Okay. I've created a Pokeno West Area 1. If we can go to the next plan. Sorry. Carry on. There we are. There's Pokeno West in detail. That is Pokeno West's urban design, roading layouts.
That's our Area 20 as per the Section 42A report, just so that the panel and everyone else is clear.
That comprises Area 1 and Area 2, Pokeno West. So what we've done is we've actually looked at the detail, looked at the roading layout, stormwater needs, and created a new dotted line. So only part of Pokeno West we're suggesting as being that has the least amount of cultural, environmental, social, and economic constraints. I mean, that piece there, you can even see it. It's immediately adjoining the Hellensley block and the sports fields. As you go into Area 2, it actually changes. There's a huge amount of green areas. Waikato District Council does not want to have enormous amounts of reserves and open space areas. Therefore, Area 1 is superior to Area 2 for that reason. There's other reasons as well. But we've gone through sort of a fairly structured process and look at the various layers as far as topography, stormwater needs, wastewater, just general location, walking circles. And so we are suggesting that Area 1, Pokeno West, has the least amount of constraints. So first cab off the rank, to keep it simple, in our view. Following that, Pokeno West Area 2, again, subject to stormwater. Then part of Pokeno Norwest, the bottom part, it's probably only a third as we would see it, again, in our view. However, Havelock Village is totally inappropriate from almost every perspective. And we implore you commissioners to please listen to iwi. We implore you to learn from our Pokeno experience. Thank you.
Thanks, Mr. Bottica. Let's see if there's any questions for you from the panel. Ms. Sedgwick?
No, nothing from me, thank you.
Mr. Fulton?
No, I think you made very clear your position. Thank you, Mr. Bottica.
Ms. Tiaho?
Not from me. Thank you very much.
Ms. Gibb?
Very clear, Mr. Bottica, thank you.
Mr. Cooney?
Yes, Mr. Bottica, how did the RL 100 play out in terms of your development and some of the others there? And maybe Ms. Simons might want to answer it as well if she wants to. But it's never been transferred over into an outstanding landscape in the proposed plan. And I accept the point. It's a rural backdrop, but some of the submitters are saying, well, that's nice to have, but it's not that necessary, and we'd rather build into that area sensitively, so that you can still get some elements of rural character in the way we design our subdivision. So what do you say about that?
But firstly, as far as the RL 100, what the actual structure plan document said is that, you know, a full prohibition against development above RL 100, but between RL 60 and 100 being sensitive in that sort of environment as well. But coming back to the RL 100, there was no land that was rezoned under plan change 14, 21 and 24 that was above RL 100. So there was no need for a particular rule or policy because there was no land zoned above RL 100 at that point in time. As far as where that came from, it came from a number of different perspectives and through consultation. Through consultations, firstly and foremost with iwi, that the ridgelines were sacrosanct, but not just iwi. It was constant consultation with the older residents of Pokeno who have been there 6 and 7 generations, and having that connection to the rural as part of the sense of place, and also in discussions with a number of different urban designers and planners. And therefore, from all of that consultation and technical work, the concept of an urban village in a rural setting was established. We didn't go to a marketing firm and look at that. That came through from consultation with various parties and all the technical expertise going into that. I mean, where we are in the Waikato. You know, we're not in Auckland, and we're just over the Bombay Hills coming into the Waikato. There is not a need to zone every piece of land, particularly inappropriate land, when there is an enormous amount of land to be rezoned. Sue touched on it with submission 9, 10, 11. There's land there that is actually significantly more appropriate than the Havelock Village. Significantly more appropriate. So
nobody's, as I understand it, nobody's seeking a zone change there, are they?
No, they are seeking it, but they haven't got
no evidence.
No evidence.
Okay, thank you.
Can I just add to that the original process, the Plan Change 24 process that PVHL went through, we were required to provide 26 reports, and 2 of those reports were dependable boundaries and visual impact. And a great deal of effort was put into making sure that this development was appropriate and provided the rural backdrop that was we all felt was necessary. It was a key element from everyone's point of view, including ours. So, you know, I can't emphasize enough that you need to have some form of structure planning here. I mean, you could have a situation, just be very, very careful here that council doesn't get themselves into a situation where they put in wastewater, for example, for Pokeno West, but have zoned several other areas that don't go ahead. And council's left holding the can because you recover that money through development contributions. So you need to be very, very careful that in my opinion, with all due respect, that council doesn't get conned into actually putting in a heck of a lot of infrastructure here that people don't take up, because these people that are asking for their land to be developed are not developers, they're landowners. And we even had the comment yesterday that they're going to come to us to seek our assistance in developing the land. Well, I've got to say we've already turned down the viability of that land, but hey, we're always open to whatever is finally decided. But I just wanted to raise that point that I fear for council at times, that decisions are made that put an onus on council that is inappropriate. And just be aware that under the Dines Fulton Hogan arrangement, we paid for all of the infrastructure for Pokeno, with the exception, the one thing that council did was provide the wastewater, and that was undersized to start because there was scepticism as to what the development size would be and rate of growth. And when Yashili and Sinlay came on board, council were at least able to recover those extra wastewater costs. So what I see here is that all of the infrastructure is going to be provided by council, and you're going to recover that through DCs. So you need to be very, very confident that the development is going to continue at this insane rate that we have at the moment. I certainly am not confident about that with my 50 odd years of experience in development.
Did you guys go as banker to get the infrastructure in?
Yes, we did. Yes, absolutely. All of the infrastructure for Pokeno, with the exception of the $12 million odd that was spent on wastewater, has all been funded by DFH.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Just one question from me, please, probably for you, Mr. Bottica. You've made mention of the rate of development at Pokeno, and you've made mention of disagreement with Mr. Thompson's figures that we heard, I think it was yesterday. His figures are vastly different from yours. I think you're at 140 a year, and if I remember correctly, his was, and I've just been trying to find it on my screen and haven't, but he was in the close to 300, I think, 240, 270, something like that. Can you help me understand why there's such a disparity between his figures and yours?
One thing may be the fact that what we're doing is we are looking at the number of completed dwellings, the number of houses. I think the table he put up was the number of building consent applications. Now, builders can look to get building consent applications in early and basically bank them and may never build them. I'm looking at completed houses.
Okay. No, that's helpful. Thank you. I just wanted to understand, because they weren't just, a decimal point apart. They seemed to me at least to be fundamentally different, and that may well be the reason. So thank you for that.
No problem.
Can I just have one further question?
Can I just ask?
Oh, sorry.
No, Mr. Fulton?
Oh,
yeah,
sorry.
Has Pokeno Holdings looked at that blocks of land that we talked about? This is 9, 10, and 11. It's alongside your land. And I know it's in private ownership, but have you approached those people about that land, or have you declined it?
Look, we've looked at land all around Pokeno, and that land has some merit. It's actually, there are a couple of streams through there. And for us, we've actually, for ourselves, we have rejected that. But what I was trying to say, that even though that we would have rejected it from our perspective, the way that we look at land and land development, it is still far superior than Havelock Village. That was the point we're trying to make. And like other developers, may want to have a look at it. But from our perspective, no, that they weren't. They didn't pass the hurdle rate, I suppose, but we have had a look at them, yes.
Thank you.
One more thing.
Can I just ask? Oh, so I'm sorry.
So there's a delay on the line, but Ms. Simons, let's carry on with the panel questions, and we'll come back to you at the end of that. Mr. Kearney?
Yeah, just a further question. You've identified the Havelock Village land. You've looked at the Pokeno West. What about the other land, number 21, that extends next door to the Munro block? What's your opinion of that?
Look, yeah, we call that Pokeno Northwest in the plan that I sent through. Look, there's a portion that's immediately adjacent to Hallinsey Road, which probably works out to be about a third of what is looking to be zoned under the Section 42A report. That is feasible. Again, there is a lot of contour issues. You start getting above RL 100 just at the top corner. There are the same sort of stormwater constraints, because you're getting very, very high up there, and the speed of the runoff and so on needs to be considered with the attenuation. But, look, part of that land is feasible.
Okay, thank you.
All right, thank you. Ms. Simons?
Yes, I just wanted to, your question regarding Adam Thompson's information that he gave the panel yesterday included the fact that it was going to be feasible on the Pokeno Westland to develop houses which would be affordable and in the range of $500,000 to $600,000. I just wanted Mr. Boddicker to address you on whether or not he agreed with that assessment.
Look, that's impossible in today's market. Absolutely impossible. The numbers that were being talked about yesterday. If we start looking at a land and house package, if we just look at the build cost, what is happening to the build cost at the moment? Our 30 different builders, I get calls from every second day complaining about that there's a new price increase of one type of building material. Timber is going up sort of weekly, and different sort of building components, anything from overseas. It is the inflationary impact of what's happening at the moment is also extraordinary. It's not just on, the house prices are going crazy. I mean, inflation in relation to materials to build a house have gone through the roof. And on top of that, that as far as the development cost, as far as what sort of cost that would be incurred through development contributions, what we did by funding it, basically there was zero interest because we were funding the infrastructure ourselves and timing the infrastructure ourselves. A huge benefit to be able to, if you can actually fund and time a bridge or level crossing when you need it. But if the other developments of expansion land is all going to be funded by council, well, there is going to be an interest component. Yes, low at the moment where interest are at the moment, but interest rates are starting to increase, particularly at sort of over longer periods. So then you come back to the actual development itself, and it is more difficult to develop. When we went through the process of Plan Change 24 in particular, it was the most logical and the easiest to develop from every perspective, including economic, that were chosen as the most likely areas, ripe for development that should be zoned as opposed to others. As you go further out from the core of Pokeno, from the Great South Road, it gets increasingly difficult. Probably the only exception to that is Pokeno East, because the contour there is actually, it's great for development. So the fact that Mr. Mead is looking at as future urban is totally logical and sound. There's some transportation issues there, but as far as the ease of development, that is totally logical.
Okay, but in terms of the value of the house packages, what would you suggest that would be a more realistic price point?
Well, I mean, it depends on the market. At the market at the moment, because you're selling something based on the market, it's not always a cost plus exercises, but there is a cost recovery exercise. So, I mean, at the moment, the market is probably somewhere around, 750 through to 900. That's sort of the core of the market. But the cost associated with Pokeno West are going to be significantly more than within the original PC 21, 24 and 14.
It is really unwise to talk about affordable housing when you're looking at land that is less desirable to develop. The Pokeno West land even, which is the most desirable of the bunch of prospects we have in front of us, still has major stormwater issues, and as it gets up into the Bombay Hills, it has major topographical issues. So the reality is that the development that's taken place to date has been on the most appropriate land, and so now it gets harder. The other thing that I find it interesting with the people that are promoting these blocks is that are they telling us that they're not necessarily going to actually get what the market will pay? Are they saying they're going to make them affordable no matter what? I think we would all understand that would be unlikely, to say the least. So I would be, and it would be very, very difficult to, unless you're going to build a sub-quality product, it would be very, very difficult to guarantee that you're going to do something for in the order of $600,000, for example. You can do that to some extent through density, but then I note in this plan change that there is no additional business land proposed. So where are these people going to work? Are they just adding to our transport woes?
All right, thanks, Mr. Dines. Look, I'm going to stop that there. The process is that the witnesses give their evidence, the panels ask their questions, which we've now done. It's not an opportunity for council to tease out more answers from witnesses that they didn't give an evidence. So I'm going to cut that off and we're going to move to the next witness. Thank you.
My apologies.
Right, the next witness is Rachel de Lambert.
No, the camera, I think, will follow me in a minute, perhaps.
Thank you.
Commissioners, obviously I addressed you on Monday for Hines, so now I'm appearing for PVHL, and I'll just briefly talk to my 12th May summary statement, and then obviously I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you.
Things that I'll address are the issue of structure planning and then the other submitters in relation to HVL, Pokeno West and CSL and top properties. So just in terms of structure planning, and that was at 2.4 of my summary statement. And as you've already heard and you know, the recent urban growth of Pokeno has been informed by a comprehensive structure plan, the Pokeno Structure Plan, or PSP as I'll call it. And this did include extensive community and iwi consultation, as well as the raft of baseline assessment work, including landscape assessment work. I wasn't involved in that, but that was part of the private plan change at that time. And so that structure planning sought to establish appropriate urban growth, as well as landscape protection enhancement, and obviously the infrastructure needs. And over the last years of development of the urban growth of Pokeno, that vision has informed the growth that has taken place. In my opinion, spatial planning or structured planning is a recognised tool for ensuring well-functioning urban developments result from urban growth. And I strongly believe that this next substantial phase of growth in Pokeno should be informed by structure planning to achieve those holistic settlement-wide outcomes and to essentially join up the outcomes from those individual landowner requests. I think just referring you back as well, this is a consistent message that I have brought to the panel in respect also of the Raglan submissions earlier. And at that time, I'm not sure if you remember, but James Lunday was the urban design witness for Rangatahi Limited, and he made a comment there that spatial planning is actually even more important in towns that have less inherent qualities of character to them. So obviously Raglan has a plethora of those, but towns like Pokeno actually are less well endowed with those natural qualities that make good environments to live in a residential sense. So in fact, structural planning is even more important in these environments that have less of those qualities to ensure that the towns that we create for the future are in fact good urban environments for the communities that live in them. So a key principle, as you know, of the PSP was the identification of maintaining a rural backdrop for Pokeno as part of the town's identity, and also, as you've heard, to address those cultural landscape values, and particularly the ridge lines that are important to mana whenua. And that's translated into this principle of protecting the land above RL 100 as a rural backdrop. And so I do consider that it would be poor planning to throw out that well-founded urban growth principle in this next phase of urban growth for Pokeno, and that the rural greenbelt is an important and valid consideration. I note that Mr. Mead does acknowledge that the retention of that rural context to Pokeno is important, but he doesn't follow through to secure that outcome. So then just turning to the submitters, HVL, Pokeno West, CSL Properties, and they have all requested inclusion of land above RL 100 into live urban zones. We addressed HVL in some detail on Monday, but just reiterating or reinforcing the evidence that you heard then from Carl Flavel, Edith Tuamata and Lucy Rutherford of Ngāti Te Ata and Ngāti Tamaapo around the cultural values of that land, and the cultural and above RL 100 land, and that's in that case tie together, so they are one and the same in that respect. So I remain of the view that the principle of protecting that rural backdrop to Pokeno by retaining the RL above 100 land in a rural land use is valid and desirable as an outcome of this next growth of Pokeno. And I note that Mr. Mead recommends rejecting the CSL top end properties request for countryside living on the steeper land of that area. So that's those 2021 areas on Mr. Mead's map. And I note that that essentially equates only to about 20 houses, so it's not a substantial portion of those sites. And then just picking up on the rebuttal evidence of Sir William Birch, and in my opinion, his suggested recommendation around an EPA for zoning for land above the 100 RL, particularly in that area 21, would achieve essentially that proverbial win-win, and that there is some opportunity for residential development, but within the context of environmental enhancement and protection that would achieve a rural backdrop. So I support that approach as a planning outcome for that land above RL 100. I just want to reinforce that this evidence isn't about stopping all growth and expansion of Pokeno. Pokeno will be one of the Waikato villages to continue to grow, but it should do that in a way that, in my opinion, will create a legacy of a community that does retain attributes of landscape which have informed the amenity of the residential area, and that it's a good planning approach to ensure that those landscape values inform part of the growth. So yes, that's my summary, and I'm happy obviously to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Lambert. We'll see if there are any questions for you. Can we start with you, please, Ms. Gibb?
No questions, thank you.
Mr. Fulton?
No, sorry, no questions, thank you.
Ms. Sedgwick?
Oh, thank you. Could I, just by way of clarification, ask you to comment on the rural landscape? Is the rural landscape based on, in your opinion, bare land, or is a planted landscape similar in a visual amenity? And I think I heard you say, but I'm not, I'd like to be clear on it, that houses with visually recessive colours and captured by planting would retain a rural landscape. Can you just clarify all that for me, please?
Yes, certainly. So yes, a planted or vegetated. Rural doesn't mean that it has to be open pasture and grazing animals. Rural is essentially around the density of housing in the landscape, and so certainly a revegetated and planted landscape would provide a rural context for Pokeno. And yes, essentially in terms of an EPA type zone for the land above RL 100, that would involve protection of existing gullies and remnant vegetation, revegetation of some areas, and then opportunities to site clustered housing in a way that would retain a rural balance of landscape but enable a level of appropriate development. That would obviously need to be master planned in a careful way for each individual site relative to its topography, but that would be the approach once zoned in that EPA zone method.
Thank you, that's helpful, thank you.
Ms. Te Aho?
No, thank you. Nice to hear from you again.
Mr. Cooney?
Yes, I'm interested in your last statement there. I was originally under the impression that you were opposed to any development above the 100 RL line. What you're saying now, well, you may have already said it in your evidence, but I didn't pick it up. Look, you can develop above that RL 100 as long as it's sensitively done in a cluster housing, and there's replanting of those areas, the more sensitive areas. Is that what you're saying?
Yes. So in my 12 May summary, paragraph 3.6, which is the last paragraph, that was responding to later evidence of Mr. Pryor and Sir William Birch for Pokeno West and CSL. They introduced, or Sir William Birch introduced, the proposition of an EPA for the land in the northwest, as it's called, so that area 21 on David Mead's map, as a way of addressing the land above RL 100. And I think that that form of approach, where the areas that have environmental values, such as the stream corridors, any remnant vegetation, are protected, and then the steeper slope areas are left without development and revegetated, but those areas that are able to be accessed and can accommodate some building platforms, you can get a low level of residential development, but an on-balance rural outcome retained. And so that's the sort of win-win outcome for that steeper backdrop, rather than, I acknowledge that a rural land use in some of those areas is no longer a viable outcome for those steep, relatively poor rural land use areas that surround that rural backdrop to Pokeno.
Okay, well, thanks for that. Just going back down, and forgive me, I think you might have answered my question a couple of days ago. With that buffer that you've proposed for the HVL site, if that was implemented, that's your buffer, that would prevent development above the 100 RL line, would it?
No, it wouldn't. So the buffer, a lot of the buffer, some of the buffer is within the RL 100, but it doesn't capture all of the area within HVL's proposed development area. So the figure 1 in my graphic supplement, the 29th of the 4th, is the diagram that I had on the screen the other day, and that shows a red outline and hatching for the land above RL 100, and then the buffer area. And so there is some overlap, but there's land outside of my recommended buffer that is above RL 100 in the HVL proposed development area.
Okay, all right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Cooney. Thank you, Mr. Lambert. I don't have any questions. Thank you. That's clear enough. Thanks very much.
The next witness then is Wes Edwards, who will question you on transportation and traffic issues.
Thank you.
Good morning, Commissioners.
Good morning.
I have just a few brief highlights to put to you, and then I'm available to assist you with questions. The first matter I'd like to talk about is employment, and at the moment there are substantial areas of land proposed to be zoned for residential development and little employment, and that will have poor transport outcomes. Most Pokeno residents would need to commute out of town for work, and that would include commuting for some distance on high-speed rural roads with increased risk of crash and injury, and there are potentially also some congestion and emissions issues. That erodes some of the benefits that come from locating growth around the edges of existing settlements. You heard yesterday there is ample employment elsewhere, and it seems to be appropriate to locate the residential growth where the employment growth is to be located. And I acknowledge it might be possible to zone some land for employment use in the future, as we heard yesterday, but without a holistic town-wide structure plan, we may be zoning land for residential uses that is best used for employment. And once that land is developed, it's very difficult to change. Second point is infrastructure. And put simply, nobody can tell us what infrastructure is going to be required to cater for all the zoned land. If we don't know what infrastructure will be required, we can't know that it is possible to provide it. We can't know how much it will cost, how many houses might need to be demolished to enable it, or when it will be delivered. And in my view, if we don't know the answers to those questions, the land isn't infrastructure ready. If the land is zoned, then there are potentially some issues around the controlling of the development. And I think most of my peers acknowledge that further work is required before development occurs. And the witnesses for Havelock Village have suggested that one way of addressing this is to require a full assessment for the first subdivision that has more than 25 lots. In my view, that approach is vastly inferior to undertaking those studies prior to confirming the zoning. Firstly, I expect this could result in a proliferation of 24-lot subdivisions scattered across the area with poor integration and progression, and potentially many lost opportunities for the provision of sensible transport links through the area between different landholdings. And those are the types of links that are important for things like public transport. Unless the ultimate infrastructure requirements are known ahead of time, it is possible that some of those new houses will be in the way of later infrastructure upgrades. For example, new houses could be constructed on the footprint of an intersection upgrade or road widening project required to provide for the development of other land. A comprehensive transport study at the time of subdivision is also likely to be an impediment to larger scale development. One developer could be hesitant to do the study in case another developer might do it instead. And to be done properly, it needs to consider the development of all the zoned land, not just the land that is subject to the subdivision proposal. I agree with the other witnesses that the best and most reliable and the most equitable way of undertaking such an investigation is for it to be led by council. In my view, this transport study needs to be undertaken in conjunction with a full structure planning exercise that will help to determine what land is best suited for what purpose. And without a Pokeno-wide structure planning exercise, there is a significant risk that the opportunity to provide the best outcome, or even any good outcome, would be foreclosed by allowing residential development to happen in a piecemeal fashion, particularly in areas that are best suited to other activities. I can deal with some site-specific matters if you wish, but I'm available to assist you.
Well, it's your evidence, Mr. Edwards, so if there's anything that you want to highlight to us, now's your opportunity, because we may not ask you about them, so it's highly over to you.
Right, just responding to some of the earlier comments in the hearings, Pokeno East, you've heard that the NZTA may upgrade the intersection out on State Highway 2. I've seen NZTA drawings that involve underpasses, and I've seen drawings that have overbridges. Those are later in the process. NZTA hasn't even designated for what it considers to be the highest priority projects yet, and there's no funding for that. So I support, to some extent, Pokeno East having a future urban zone, except that In my view, future urban implies that the area is suitable for development at some time, and the main issue with Pokeno East is that it has to be well connected with the remainder of Pokeno. That requires a new connection across State Highway 1. I haven't yet seen one that would work. With Pokeno West and Top End, my concerns around servicing the upper levels from Ridge Road remain, and all of the other concerns I raised about the transport assessments that have been done are still remaining. They haven't been addressed. I do acknowledge that the area closest to Hellensley Road would appear to be the most feasible to develop. However, being infrastructure ready depends on the funding being committed, and that hasn't occurred. The Havelock Village land is severely constrained with respect to access. I don't support access onto Bluff Road and Pioneer Road. That, in my view, would lead to traffic using State Highway 1 to access the part of Pokeno Village. That's undesirable. The access via Hitchin Road, most of Hitchin Road is formed to a good collector road standard, except that the upper end is formed to a narrower and steeper standard that isn't appropriate for accessing the size development proposed for Havelock. It might be possible to reconstruct the upper section of that road, but that may impact on existing recently subdivided land. And that leaves Yarshilly Drive, and as others have pointed out, the land that Havelock has access to and control of is only 12 metres wide. In my view, that is completely insufficient for servicing a development of that scale. So in my view, Havelock is not appropriate for development, and it is certainly not infrastructure ready. That's the end of my statement.
All right, thank you, Mr. Edwards. I'll just see if the panel have any questions for you. Can I start with you, Ms. Sedgwick, please?
Indeed, just one, thank you for your evidence. Just one small question. What is the distance currently between Pioneer Road and the off-ramp for Pokeno?
So from memory, there's quite a short distance, certainly less than half a kilometre between the end of the Pioneer Road entrance to the motorway and the beginning of the off-ramp.
Thank you. I had about half a kilometre in my head as well, so thank you for that. Thank you for your evidence.
Thank you, Ms. Gibb.
No, nothing, thank you.
Mr. Fulton?
Yeah, just one question. You were talking about the development on Pokeno East, and you talked about State Highway 2, and in my experience, sometimes you don't know who comes first, whether it's the development forces the roading, or are we going to wait on the roading before the development could take place? And I think if we waited that way, we would never get any roading done. So I think my opinion of a lot of the stuff has been pressure developed by development, which has actually forced the roading issues to be sorted out. Is that an experience you would have had?
Well, yes, there is certainly development can lead to infrastructure projects being brought forward. I do acknowledge, however, though, that if we look at the NPSUD, it's very clear that council has to be certain that the infrastructure provided by council and by other agencies is able to be provided and will be provided, and sets out very clear requirements for what counts as development ready in the medium term.
Okay, because NZTA can procrastinate a long time on a lot of these things, can't they? And they just don't seem to want to get things done. But with pressure put on them, they have to change. I mean, we've also got a political direction as well, which is sometimes impeding some of this development.
I think none of our agencies have too much money. They've always got more projects to do than there is money to do. They have to prioritise. I don't think they're reluctant to do these projects. I don't think they're able to because they don't have sufficient funding. So that's probably more the answer to the question, I think.
Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Tiaho?
Nothing from me, thank you.
Mr. Cooney?
Mr. Chair, I would like a question.
Sure.
If that's possible.
Of course.
Just occurs to me, there was a comment made about the land that Havelock Village has only being 12 metres wide up from Yashili Drive. I think that's what was said. In your opinion, sir, would that be because, would that be the reason why we're being told that would only be a private road if it went ahead?
Whether it's private or not is dependent on whether council will accept it as a vested road. Most roading controlling authorities that I'm aware of wouldn't accept a road vested at that width, but neither would they accept a subdivision private road of that width to serve that number of houses. And I would say too, there's more to a road than just the carriageway. You might be told that we can provide a standard width carriageway in there, but there's more to a road than just the width between the curb lines. There's footpaths, cycle paths, trees, services, parking, all kinds of other things. So unless they were able to acquire some additional land, I think the ability to service development from Yashili Drive is very limited and insufficient.
Okay, thanks for that.
Thank you. Can I just ask you about the point you've raised about public transport? And you've said that it's currently limited. Isn't that just the reality anywhere in Waikato? And wherever you go, you're constrained in terms of public transport. I mean, we've got a train service that has recently started. I was listening to the radio on the way home last night, and someone said they'd driven past it and it was empty. I don't know if that's the case, but they're the anecdotal reports. Isn't that just an inevitability that public transport connections from Waikato to wherever are going to require a groundswell of change? And it doesn't matter whether you're master planned or structure planned. There's no magic wand you can wave to solve that problem.
I would agree, I think, with most of what you've said. A big impetus for people using public transport is because it's easier than the alternatives, particularly in Auckland. Public transport can be faster and cheaper than driving your car and parking it in the city. That is less of an issue in Waikato. I think there is potential, obviously, for a rail passenger station to be created in Pokeno if the rail service is extended. But most of the area is sort of beyond an easy walking catchment. Most of the area that we're looking at rezoning is. So buses, a shuttle bus running around the town like as currently occurs in Pukekohe, could be one way of assisting people, but the most likely is that people will use their cars, even if it is to travel to a park and ride.
All right, thank you very much. Thanks for your evidence, Mr. Edwards.
Thank you.
I think we'll take the morning tea break now. We're going to take our break now, Ms. Simons. We'll resume at 5 to 11, and if we could just have an indication. I think our predictions as to timing are probably unfolding and coming true. So we do need to hear back from parties after the break on those alternative dates. And just to remind you that they are the afternoon of the 24th of June, and then sometime on either the 1st, 2nd, 7th or 8th of July. So we'll address that when we return. Please don't log off. Just mute your screen and turn the video off if you want to do something privately. All right, welcome back, everybody. Let me just change my screen. Is the panel all? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 panels all here. Ms. Simons is there, the Pokeno Village team are there, Ms. Evatt is there. Can we just, before we start though, just get a bit of clarity around where we're going on the assumption that we don't finish today, which I think is pretty much inevitable, how we're going on those replacement days that we mentioned. Ms. Evatt, you're probably in the front and centre on that. Where have you got to?
Good morning, sir. Mr. Gribbin here. Ms. Evatt is just out of the room for the minute. I understand that the first or the second is acceptable for Havelock.
All right, thank you. Does first or second cause anybody, I mean, it probably doesn't absolutely, I mean, we're not requiring people to be present. They can watch the videos after the event if they want to hear anything, and there's no opportunities for questioning and so forth. So, but I will give anyone the opportunity to say now whether the first or second is a problem. If it becomes a problem for any one of the panel, there may be one of us that may not be able to make all the dates, and I don't have those in front of me. What we propose to do with that is to for that panel member to continue to sit, and they'll watch the recording of the hearing to bring themselves up to speed. It seems a shame to absent them from the decision-making process, given that they've heard 95% of the information and read all of it. So we'll run with does the panel have a view on the first or second? I think we're okay. Ms. Tiahu, I think it was you that had a problem on both of those dates, but they were okay for everybody else. So I think we'll run with the first unless there's any objection to that, and we'll do it in the morning so that we don't run out of time just in the off chance that we run a little bit longer than anticipated. All right, there's no objection to that, so we'll conclude today somewhere after 3:30, 4:45, 4 o'clock, somewhere around about there, and resume again on the first. All right, Ms. Simon, thank you.
Yes, thank you, sir. I've got my voice back. I now have 2 witnesses left to give evidence. Those are Dale Pace, firstly, on the issue of stormwater. So she can proceed now.
Thank you.
Good morning, and thank you, Commissioners, for pre-reading my evidence. I won't summarise it now, but I would like to address 3 points that have come up over the last couple of days. And these all relate to the specific issue of the practice of attenuating stormwater runoff. The first is about taking a side-by-side approach versus a whole of catchment approach. The second is whether attenuating to less than the pre-development amount, so 80% has been suggested, is an appropriate alternative to a whole of catchment approach. And the third is the matter of timing, that if there is to be a whole of catchment study, at what time in the process is it appropriate that that is done? So to my first point, in many circumstances, but not in all circumstances, attenuating runoff from a site or from a subdivision so that peak flows are no greater than the pre-development peak flows is an appropriate way to mitigate effects on downstream stormwater and downstream property flood risk. For Pokeno, because of the scale of the proposed rezoning we're contemplating here, and because of the fact that there are non-existing downstream flood risk issues, it's not going to be suitable to apply this practice of matching pre-development peak flows throughout all of these proposed rezoning areas. I've talked in my evidence around the issues of timing, coincident peaks and duration as to why it's not appropriate to apply this practice everywhere, and I think that was understood and generally agreed with. But on the basis of that, I have been recommending a whole of catchment study that looks at the cumulative effect of all this development and pinpoints where it's appropriate to do attenuation and where it's unhelpful to do attenuation throughout the catchment. Now, to my second point, it has been suggested that attenuating runoff to 80% of the pre-development peak flow is essentially an acceptable alternative to doing this kind of comprehensive whole of catchment study. I agree with this. It is an approach that's applied reasonably often. In fact, there was a study done by the former Monaco City Council in the early 2000s that looked at this specifically to see if attenuating back even further and as far as 80% would cover these risks off instead of doing the full catchment study. And that approach was adopted by Monaco City. It was pulled into Auckland Regional Council guidance. And I've noted it's subsequently been adopted by Waikato Regional Council. And they're pretty clear that they would accept that in absence of there being a catchment study. So it's perfectly appropriate in comment. And I know that, I think Mr. Pitt carefully has proposed this in rebuttal for Havelock. Now, there are a couple of reasons why you wouldn't do this. This is a conservative approach. So you end up with, if you imagine your attenuation is done in a pond, your pond gets a lot bigger. It's bigger than it needs to be. So you will have a consequential loss of developable land. You will have a proportional increase in capital costs, but you will also have that same increase in operational and maintenance costs. Usually these assets are then invested in council. So those operational costs then accumulate across the catchment and are probably higher than they would need to be if a whole of catchment study was done. The reason and the useful, the useful part of this method is it allows developers to move faster than a council catchment planning process, which does happen from time to time. So to my last point, it was about the timing of a full catchment study and when these issues have to be nutted out, basically whether that should be done pre-live zoning or post-live zoning. Now, I'm not a planner, but I do have a couple of points to make here. The first is that in the large-scale rezoning projects I've been involved in, this has been done before rezoning. And interestingly, in both cases, being Drury South and Pairata Rise, resulted in a reduction in the amount of area given over to these types of devices. My second point is that it's difficult. What I've noticed in the technical submission, technical evidence that was supporting the submissions, where engineering evidence was provided describing the stormwater philosophy, it was generally quite comprehensive and detailed and reasonably good. But none of these individual studies addressed the cumulative effect of all of the development and all of the attenuation in the catchment, and nor could they. That information is not available to them. My understanding is that Waikato District Council has been doing this catchment study in the year that I've been involved. It has been in the works. It just hasn't been shared at this moment. And I just suggest that if we wait for this to be bottomed out at subdivision time, that constraint on each of the individual submitters still remains, that those engineers, say, doing that assessment still won't have the access to the wider catchment picture. And that I don't see any particular reason why it couldn't be done now. A relatively simple piece of work. Thank you. I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Ms. Pace. Can we start with you, Ms. Gibb, please?
No questions, thank you.
Ms. Cedric?
No, pardon me, no, you quite accurately picked up on the theme of yesterday, but your explanation is very clear. Thank you.
Ms. Tiaho?
Just in terms of the last conclusion in your highlights package, you say rezoning is appropriate and recommend it's supported by the catchment spatial plans. Would you go so far to say that it would be subject to those spatial plans? Your recommendation?
That would be my recommendation.
Thank you.
Mr. Fulton?
It's just a question on, are there any stormwater management plans in Pokeno at the moment over the development that's been done so far? Is there any of this catchment ponding been established?
The most recent published stormwater management plan was published in 2010. I have the reference to it in my evidence and not on the top of my head, and I've referred to it in my assessment. This is available on Waikato District Council's website, but there is a note there saying that that is currently being updated, and that updated version hasn't yet been made available. It does cover some of the development that it covers the development that is currently underway, but which is only about half of the development in these catchments that is now contemplated.
I suppose my question is really the development that has been done so far, and there is some ponds. Are they for the purpose of stormwater management in what has already been developed?
They're for the purposes largely in managing what has already been developed, and additional, and what has been proposed as additional in this round of submissions.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Cooney?
Why would there be a need for a whole of catchment study when there's a directive in the policy statement that you need 80% attenuation to address stormwater effects? So how does a whole of catchment study change that? That's a directive. You tell us that's a directive in the policy statement. So you shouldn't be hiding from that. Should any developer shouldn't be hiding from that. So where does the whole of catchment study fit in terms of that directive?
I didn't understand that to be there to be a specific directive in the policy statement that attenuating to 80% throughout was a good idea. What I'm referring to is in paragraph 6.7 of my evidence, and that is Waikato Regional Guidance on Peak Flow Control. And they, if I can quote,
sure.
Where this 80% idea comes in. And there are 5 points here about peak flow control. One of them is where there are existing downstream flooding issues, depending on the site's position in the catchment, it is recommended that the post-development peak discharge for the 100-year ARI rainfall for a new development be limited to 80% of the pre-development peak discharge, unless there is a catchment study that demonstrates that this is not required. So the point I would like to make there is this is an acceptable alternative, it could be done, but a catchment study that demonstrates this is not required then may eliminate the need for half of these ponds in the catchment and that developable land loss and cost associated with them. And therefore, doing a catchment study that looks at that as a whole would be, in my opinion, preferable than relying on that 80%.
Okay. A lot of these ponds, I think you mentioned that they may become a burden on the council. A lot of them turn into sort of amenity values, don't they? With public access to them and walk around them and things like that.
I'd agree. I'm a big wetland fan.
Yeah.
I like to visit them on weekends. They do still require some maintenance. I wouldn't say a burden necessarily, but there is always some maintenance required of a stormwater management device.
So you go on a busman's holiday quite often, walking around stormwater ponds.
Very frequently.
Okay, thank you for that.
Sounds a bit sad to me, but never mind. Won't ask you any further questions on that basis. Can we go back to very first principles though? And if we look at the current situation, what we have in the built part of Pokeno is a combination, as I understand it, of buried infrastructure, e.g. pipes, and retention structures on the surface.
Mm-hmm.
We then go up the catchment to where some of these new proposals are being undertaken. And if we go back to first principles, given that no one is realistically likely to dig up the existing town, if you like, to replace pipes with bigger pipes or to increase the size of the retention structures that are already there, what are the sorts of things that a catchment-wide study at Pokeno might actually do any differently in the upstream end from putting in retention devices? What else is in the bag of tricks?
Mm-hmm. So as you suggested, we'll talk from first principles. And so I want to consider stormwater runoff in 3 different types of events. So your day-to-day event, your primary event, which is what gets carried by pipe networks, and your secondary event where we're worried about flood risk. Your day-to-day event is, say, 0 to 20 mil of rainfall, and that's where we worry about water quality. So the things that would be in your bag of tricks and are entirely appropriate to be on-site measures are water quality treatment devices. And the other thing in your bag of tricks that's at a catchment level are riparian planting management. This is all the stream health water quality stuff. So that second level, the primary event, the flows that get conveyed through pipes, I agree. I don't think anyone's going to be digging up any of the primary network, nor do I think they need to in this circumstance. For the most part, these proposed development areas can discharge to streams themselves, so develop their pipe network at the time. And that can be managed with the pipe network and some attenuation. So yes, attenuation is still the answer, often for that if you want to manage those effects. So then lastly, flood risk. So flood risk, you're looking at events where your primary network is swamped and everything's making its way to stream channels and overland flow paths down the road. And here what we're worried about are vulnerable activities. That would be residential housing. We don't want to increase the flood risk on those. And also regionally important infrastructure. So in this case, we would be thinking about the culvert under State Highway 1 and the rail culvert and Great South Road culvert and safety issues around all of that. Here, your bag of tricks is actually improvements, can include improvements on those structures themselves. And I know that some improvements have been proposed to the State Highway 1 culvert and the Great South Road culvert just upstream. I don't think those have been done, and certainly the Great South Road culvert, when I looked at it yesterday, hasn't been touched. So you can expand those and improve those so that those regionally significant structured assets are better protected. But you're right, coming back to the individual sites, yes, it is attenuation. That is the main thing on your bag of tricks. We can't make this water disappear in these catchments. If we had fractured basalt that we could discharge to, that could make some of it go away. But all we can do is slow down that flow. I still think attenuation is appropriate. It's just not necessary absolutely everywhere in the catchment. And if you put it in the wrong place, you can have that unintended adverse outcome.
Right, thank you. That's very helpful. Thanks for that answer, and thanks for your evidence and answer of panel's other questions. Thank you.
Thank you.
The final witness, Commissioner says Chris Grafton, who's going to address you on planning matters, obviously. Thank you.
Good.
Good morning, Commissioners.
Morning, Mr. Grafton.
So, yeah, I'm going to try and take you through what I think are the key matters that are still outstanding that are covered in my statements of evidence. There are two interrelated issues I want to focus on, being the use of spatial planning exercises to support rezoning and the appropriateness or otherwise of deferring assessment of some of these matters to the resource consent process. My primary statement at paragraph 312 identifies what I consider to be the key urban growth matters that the district plan needs to address to adequately give effect to the NPSUD and the RPS. And to kind of break that down very simply, it's how much development capacity should be enabled, how should it be enabled in terms of the short, medium and long term, and crucially, what in addition to the sufficient development capacity should be enabled to ensure the achievement of well-functioning urban environments. And in terms of what is meant by well-functioning urban environments, the NPS is pretty clear. Objective 1 of the NPS directs the achievement of them, and policy 1 of the NPS essentially defines what they are. And I set that definition out at paragraph 3.7 of my primary statement. Now, in terms of deferring the matters, I know the reporting officers essentially said that he believes a lot of the kind of structure plan issues that would be considered can be deferred to the subdivision process. Sorry, to the resource consent process. I assume that this means that he considers that a lot of the matters that would be considered in terms of achieving a well-functioning urban environment can be deferred to resource consents. I disagree with this view. I would accept that a lot of matters can be deferred to resource consent process, but when you look closely at policy 1 of the NPS in terms of how a well-functioning urban environment is defined, I don't consider that the provision of a variety of sites that are suitable for different business sectors in terms of location and site sizes is a matter that can be readily considered through a resource consent process. That to me is about the distribution of certain land uses and how they contribute to a well-functioning urban environment. Providing good accessibility for all people between housing, jobs, community services, natural spaces, open spaces, including by way of public or active transport. Again, that to me is something that is best considered through a spatial planning exercise. And the third key part of that definition in policy 1 is the supporting the reduction in greenhouse gas emission. And again, to me, one way of addressing that is to consider when proposing residential areas, where do those people work and looking at reducing significant journeys to work. In my view, these matters are best addressed through an appropriate spatial planning exercise. As per the NPSUD, are important matters to consider in the context of achieving well-functioning urban environments. A risk of not applying a more holistic approach to the development of these communities is not achieving those well-functioning urban environments. And I'd note that, just as an additional point, this is exactly the type of matter that was considered through the Pokeno structure plan in terms of the distribution of land use, how the growth of the town related to the existing town centre, the role and function of the school as the heart of the community, the amount of additional industrial land to provide for employment opportunities, and looking at getting degrees of self-sufficiency in terms of that land use outcome. So that's all I wanted to cover. I'm conscious of there's a lot in my evidence, but I'm conscious of time, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Well, we don't want to rush you. I mean, you've been very succinct, and you know you've had 10 minutes. Others have used considerably more than that. But if you feel there are anything that you want to stress, then you should do that.
I've obviously listened to the last couple of days of the hearing when I've been able to, and I've tried to focus that commentary on what I consider to be the kind of matters that have arisen. I'm quite happy to leave it there and see if there's any questions.
All right, no, that's fine. I just wanted to make sure that you had the opportunity to say what you wanted to, rather than say you were cut short because of pressures of time, because that's why we've allocated that extra time till the week after next. But anyway, that's fine. Let's see if there are any questions. Mr. Fulton?
Yeah, just a question on if, for instance, there was a direction given to develop a structure plan for Pokeno, how long would it be a 2-year process, or where would you think could be a realistic time frame for that to happen?
It's a good question. I mean, with the Pokeno structure plan, I was involved in that process. In fact, it was my first real planning job in New Zealand when I arrived. That was a very comprehensive process that was undertaken over quite a considerable amount of time. And the time was really spent engaging with the community. Now, I've since seen structure planning exercise has been taken a lot more succinctly and more focused. I wouldn't want to give you a guess of time, but I think you can cut the cloth to suit the issue. I'd also say I don't necessarily think it's the time required for the planning exercise that is going to be the issue of the growth of Pokeno. I think it's more likely to be the timing and provision of the appropriate infrastructure. That, as we've seen in Auckland, even in areas that are future urban zones, it's the provision of infrastructure that's causing the issues, not necessarily the planning exercise.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Tiaho?
I don't have any questions. Thank you.
Ms. Sedgwick?
No, none for me. Thank you very much. It's very clear, and I appreciate your input.
That's good.
Yes, I've been thinking since Mr. Botica spoke. He mentioned availability of land for schools, or an extension of the primary school and a possible high school, secondary school. And in your opinion, since you do know this area very well and you were involved in the structure plan originally, have you thought ever about what area would or could be identified for extra educational facilities?
Absolutely. In fact, that was a part of the structure planning exercise we undertook. We engaged closely with the school about their needs and with the Ministry of Education in terms of when would the school require additional space. And in fact, the structure plan that was in Plan Change 24 identifies that the intention was that the school would expand north and up, so into the land just north of where the existing school is. Now, I don't think that, obviously there's a role there for the ministry in terms of school expansions and plans, and things would have changed over time, but it was absolutely a critical part of the structure planning exercise.
So was that just the primary school, or did you give some thought to a secondary school?
We considered the need of a secondary school, and we tested that with the ministry. And the view was, based on the projections of what was required for Plan Change 24, a secondary school wouldn't be warranted in terms of the catchment and the numbers. I would suggest that that's something that would need to be reconsidered with additional growth of the community, because I think it was pretty close.
Yes.
From memory.
Okay. I was just trying to see on the map that the planner, the S42 report writer had put in, where there might be available land, and it's sort of looking to me like it's around that sports field. Is that correct? Correct? Okay. Thanks very much. Yes.
That was a critical part of the structure plan, was the interrelationship of the educational facilities and the recreational facilities. So the intention was that the school would be able to use the sports park as a shared facility.
Yes.
So that was absolutely key. And again, the structure plan includes many principles about supporting that hub.
Okay, thanks very much for that.
Thank you. Mr. Kearney?
And just on that point, the provision of additional schools doesn't necessarily require a structure plan, and indeed often the education people will come in and designate once they look at the growth and potential growth. Do you agree with that?
Absolutely, and that was, again, that was part of the discussion with the ministry, and the intention through the structure planning process was to make that process for them in the future as easy as possible. So again, the structure plan identifies where it was anticipated the school would come in and the ministry would be designating to expand.
Well, no, what I'm saying is that structure plans quite often don't even identify where schools are, identify the future growth areas and different infrastructure, and the education people follow behind and designate where they think is appropriate.
I would say if an educational facility was deemed to be required in an area that was being structure planned, it should absolutely form part of the consideration, and the ministry should be engaged with to try and identify a preferred site. There's a lot of principles that you would follow in terms of what type of what type of development should occur in close proximity to a school. And obviously the ministry can come and designate where they choose, but it would be good planning practice to me to try and integrate those processes as best you could.
Okay, just moving away from that topic, you mentioned the need for a spatial plan. The NPSUD doesn't actually say you require a spatial plan before you promote rezoning of land, does it?
It doesn't. No, it doesn't say. It doesn't say. Well, not that I've seen specifically mention any kind of planning mechanism or tool like a spatial planning process.
No.
But it does clearly have a direction about achieving well-functioning urban environments.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I accept that, but indeed, in some ways, it promotes it under Policy 8. You've got to be responsive to plan changes that would add significantly to development capacity and contribute to well-functioning urban environments. So that sort of direction to council is more or less saying, well, you've got to be a little bit nimble about this.
Yeah, correct. But I think, I mean, Policy 8 essentially says be nimble if there's a proposal put forward, so a plan change that would firstly add significantly to development capacity and is unanticipated by RMA planning documents or out of sequence. So in my mind, that policy is really saying, well, look, if the land use pattern is settled and somebody comes forward with a plan change to rezone land which can contribute to achieving good development capacity, and it's not anticipated in a document like Future Proof, for example, then it should be considered on its merits.
Yeah, there's a the jury's out on what a plan change vis-a-vis a plan review issue, whether you take a broader view of that policy. And so we've got a situation here where submitters are saying, well, this land wasn't promoted under the proposed plan, but we think it's appropriate to be rezoned. So the question is, well, should we be responsive to that in terms of the appropriateness of that land for future urban use? Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I agree. I agree with the sentiment. I mean, I think that through the plan review process, that's absolutely what needs to be considered in terms of the proposals put forward by landowners seeking rezoning.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Thanks, Mr. Kearney. Just following up on that, Mr. Scrafton, I suppose we'd all accept that in an ideal world, everything would be sort of master planned and mapped out for quite a long time into the future, so everybody had certainty and all those sorts of things. But the challenge that we have as a panel at the moment is that this plan was notified. Since it's been notified, we've got the NPS urban development. We're also in the midst of a number of growth studies, you know, like the Central Corridor. There's a whole raft of them. But I guess given that changing landscape, if we were to take the approach that you're suggesting across the district, we'd be pretty much stuck with what's in the notified plan, wouldn't we? And the whole of the rezoning hearings, for the most part at least, would be a waste of time.
Yeah, I don't think that's a sensible proposition. And I should be clear, I'm not suggesting that development capacity doesn't need to be provided. I think that the panel, it is an ever-changing landscape. I would say that urban development capacity NPS was available prior to the NPS UD. But I agree with you. I think that there's several, you know, and we've discussed this on a number of hearings, and several growth strategies which complicate matters with varying demand and capacity projections. I think just bringing it back, I think that the issue you have here is essentially, particularly with Pokeno, the rezoning proposition in front is simply residential. And yes, residential development capacity is needed. The NPS UD says to achieve well-functioning urban environments, it's not just about providing houses. So I guess in terms of if I was to be providing a recommendation to the panel, I guess I would say I would probably exert some caution in terms of how you would approach providing that development capacity in the absence of a wider spatial planning exercise.
All right, no, thank you for that, Mr. Scrafton. I have no further questions. Thanks very much for your evidence and your answers.
Thank you.
That concludes the case. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the Pokeno Holdings Limited.
Thank you, Ms. Simons. That brings us to Yashili, please. I just need to declare that I have previously acted for Yashili back in quite some time ago when they were initially consenting their existing operation at Pokeno. I don't believe that I haven't acted for them on the plan and haven't acted for them on anything like this for some time. So I just wanted to declare that before we move on. Thank you.
Right. Good morning, Commissioners. Sorry, just having a little trouble with the video for Yashili, but my name is Emma Manohar and I'm appearing as counsel for Yashili. And I have with me today Jason Jones, who will just introduce himself.
Good morning, Commissioners.
morning.
Jason Jones from Resource Management Group.
Thank you.
So just by way of background, Yashili is a further submitter in respect of two submissions. They are the submissions by Havelock Village Limited and Rainbow Water Limited, both seeking the rezoning of land to the southeast of Yashili's existing dairy processing plant from rural to residential. Now both those submissions are being pursued by Havelock Village Limited jointly now. Yashili is strongly supportive of the ongoing growth and development of Pokeno, and as a result, it supports the additional housing and population that would be created by the rezoning sought by HVL. Additional population will assist to improve the economic vitality of Pokeno and will provide much needed residential land and promote affordable.
Your video's come back, but the sound's disappeared. I think. Is everybody else having that same issue? Is the rest of the panel have they lost contact with?
I can't hear anything.
No, I can't hear anything.
We could see something for a moment. I can see into a meeting room at DLA Piper. I can see two people sitting there, but I can't hear anything anymore. I don't think the rest of us can either. So whatever you did to fix the video has jiggered the sound.
They haven't probably switched on the audio.
It's not showing it as being muted.
No, but the connection.
Hmm. Mr. Bell, have you got any words of wisdom?
I think she's come through on another link.
Which is muted by the look of it.
Sorry, is it?
We've got you back, but yes, you're back.
I've muted her other one, should be right. May I suggest turn the volume down on one and mute one, and have it unmuted and the volume up on one.
It's interesting that we've done, I'm not sure how many of these hearings now, and the only whoopsies we've had have been by legal counsel on Zoom. I'll leave you to draw your own conclusions about that.
Thanks.
Ms. Manaha is muted on both the connections that she has.
Is that any better? I think I've just tried to kill one system and leave the other one live.
We can hear you but can't see you, but that's okay. I think it's more important that we can hear what you're saying. Oh, now we can do both. That's fine. As long as you cut the sound off as you turn it.
Commissioners.
That's fine. We're good to go.
We've moved offices, and sometimes our technology just decides to play games with us. I think I was partway through just a general overview, which was that Yashili is strongly supportive of the ongoing growth and development of Pokeno, and as a result, it supports the additional housing and population that would be created by the rezoning of the site. The additional population will assist to improve the economic vitality of the area, and the rezoning will provide much needed residential land and will promote the affordable houses and housing choice, including for employees at Yashili's plant.
Its further submission was in conditional support of the rezoning, subject to the inclusion of adequate mitigation measures and/or an appropriate setback distance between the proposed residential development and its existing industrial sites, to address any potential adverse reverse sensitivity effects. In particular, noise was one of the main concerns there. We usually filed 3 statements of evidence from Mr. Don McKenzie on traffic, Mr. Hegley on noise, and Mr. Jones on planning, which raised concerns with the framework that was initially proposed by HVL. Those concerns have now been addressed in a way that will protect Yashili's interests, and I'll hand over to Mr. Jones to talk through how we got there and what that package looks like. I know we are going before HVL, so it's a little bit out of order, but hopefully it is straightforward to follow. And I do just also want to acknowledge that Yashili is aware that though it has reached agreement with HVL, the decision is ultimately the panel's on the framework.
And just to be clear, you're not now planning to call Mr. McKenzie or Mr. Hegley because
no, we didn't consider it was necessary given the agreement reached, and that HVL's witnesses would address any residual traffic or noise concerns.
Thanks.
Good morning. Mr. Chair, if you're happy, I've just prepared 2 pages worth of notes, seeing as my evidence in chief has moved on with the joint witness conferencing that I've conducted with Mr. Ptolemage for Havelock Village.
Yes.
So I thought that might be the most expeditious, just to tell a brief story about where we were and where we're at now.
Do you want, I mean, I've got your joint witness statement here. Do you want me to put that on the screen, or are you just going to talk to it?
I think that'd be very useful, actually, because I was going to ask if you thought it would be helpful to talk just spatially about where we are and what the key issue is.
Well, I'll put it on the screen and we'll take it from there, shall we? You
Thank you.
Carry on as you wish, but
that's great. So I'll go back to my original engagement by Yashili. It was in July of last year, and the scope of that involvement was twofold. Firstly, just to assess the proposal that Havelock was proposing at that time, and also to provide planning evidence once we got to this stage. Shortly after that engagement, I visited the site and the local vicinity. And there I was briefed by Yashili management about the current operations and their plans for expansion in the near future. And that's including a new UHT processing facility on some vacant land behind the existing operation, which is also immediately adjoining the Havelock land. So this might be a convenient time to turn to the joint witness statement. And to page 4 of that, there's a figure that's figure 16.4.18b. So the Yashili block, if you like, if you start in the top right-hand corner of this image, their current operation is on that block, the triangular block you can see, which goes all the way down to Gateway. And that's correct. And then those 2 rectangles immediately to the southwest, that's the Yashili expansion area. So it's currently vacant, and that's where the UHT processing facility would be proposed to go. What you can see just to the end of that red line, the access leg in off Yashili Drive, the white roading area there is Yashili Drive.
Okay.
So a key point to make while we're on this image is Yashili's interests not only relate to reverse sensitivity effects on their current operation, but also on those future expansion plans. And my evidence in chief was focused squarely on those matters, with particular attention paid to the development proposal, the technical assessments, and the associated plan provisions described in the evidence in chief of Havelock's expert witnesses. In my evidence, I identified aspects of Havelock's evidence, which I considered to be unclear, and I expressed the view that Havelock should provide additional information to address those matters, and that's summarized at paragraph 27 of my evidence in chief. Relying on the evidence of Yashili's 2 technical experts, Mr. McKenzie and Mr. Hegley, I also recommended that additional rules and matters of discretion should be incorporated into the proposed plan. to enable urbanisation of the Havelock land in a manner that does not undermine the operation and future development of Yashili's facilities. Having assessed those additional rules and matters against the relevant objectives and policies in the proposed plan, I concluded that the proposed amendments would be more appropriate at achieving that direction. As noted by Mr. Ptolemaish, Havelock and Yashili's experts have conferred in April and May with a view of narrowing issues in contention and reaching consensus about some appropriate plan provisions. And this culminated in the production of the JWS, which you have before you, which does have a full set of agreed policies, rules, matters of discretion, and associated figures attached. And those agreed amendments have addressed all of the issues I identified in my evidence in chief within the scope of Yashili's further submissions, and I consider the provisions are appropriate should the panel be minded to rezone the Havelock land. The majority of the agreed provisions relate to the management of noise at the interface, and these are really well described, I think, in the highlights package of Mr. Stiles. So I'm sure you will have read that. It's at section 3 of Mr. Stiles' evidence. In essence, the key issues that have been incorporated into these provisions, or the provisions themselves, are the inclusion of a new Pokeno industry buffer, within which new sensitive activities would fall as a non-complying activity. And Mr. Chair, this would probably be a good time to flip to the last page of the joint witness statement. Thank you. And if you just scroll up that little bit higher, sorry, to the top of the page where you can see the purple industrial.
Oh, sorry, okay, sorry.
So you see the blue hatched area that's immediately adjacent to the industrial zone. So that's correct. That's correct. And it extends all the way across to the eastern boundary there. But obviously within the scope of Yashili's submission, we're talking principally about that, that land there that you're highlighting now.
Absolutely.
So within that area, new sensitive activities would fall as non-complying activities. Then when we go beyond that area and you see the light blue wavy line, that can roughly be, yes, sir, that can roughly be summarized as an outer control boundary. And between that line and the buffer, any new sensitive activities would have to be insulated appropriately to achieve noise reduction and mechanical ventilation. There's also a consequential amendment that's been agreed to the noise generation standard in the general industrial zone. And that's to clarify that new noise generation within the industrial zone won't be assessed at the zone boundary with Havelock. Instead, it'll be assessed from beyond the buffer. And that's to, again, protect that ability at present for these activities to generate more noise in the future through anticipated industrial activities, akin to what they could do now, essentially. There's also a new location-specific policy that subdivision and development of the area will minimize the potential for reverse sensitivity to arise through a combination of means. As noted by Mr. Stiles, the provisions take account of the existing industrial noise generation enabled by the plan or associated resource consents for these activities, as well as additional noise that could be reasonably generated by Yashili and others, including via future potential expansions. In addition to the acoustic considerations, specific matters of discretion have been incorporated into the agreed provisions to address the transport-related matters identified in the evidence of Mr. McKenzie. And Mr. Ptolemaish and I agree that these matters will ensure that future development of the Havelock land will be subject to appropriate assessments on the safe, efficient function of the transport network, including in the immediate vicinity of Yashili's operation. Overall, my view is that the agreed provisions are appropriate and will best ensure the plan's collective aims for reverse sensitivity and for safe, efficient, and well-integrated infrastructure networks are implemented effectively. And sir, if in long form, I did provide a table after paragraph 84 in my evidence in chief that identifies the specific policies that I'm referring to and objectives that I'm referring to there. and I'm happy to take any questions about that or any of the other matters in my evidence.
Thank you. Sorry, I also realised that I was trying to find a document on my screen while I was still sharing it, so apologies for that. All right, let's see if there's any questions. Thank you, Mr. Jones. Can we start with you, please, Ms. Sedgwick?
Yes, thank you. All of the collateral that I see for Yashili shows a really nice factory set in an extremely rural setting, I suppose is the way I could describe it. So can you tell me how you would see the residential effects of rezoning there as affecting the integral part of Yashili?
The key issues that Yashili has expressed concern about, and which relate to, in my view, the key issue at the interface, are those of noise and of transport effects. And that's been the key focus of the agreed rule package, to try to manage the potential for reverse sensitivity on those future urban uses at the Havelock land. And in my view, we've provided for noise mitigation and for appropriate buffers to be used so that the residential uses can proceed and not undermine Yashili's operations.
I'm looking at it more from how you currently style yourself as a company, and it is clearly in a rural background. So that appears to be your unique selling point, if you want. So I'm just struggling how a more intensified background right around you essentially is I struggle with it. If you don't have any comment, that's fine. But feel free to comment on that.
Perhaps I could just say I'm a consultant that's been appointed by Yashili, so I can't speak for Yashili's own views on the backdrop and the extent to which they have a view about whether they prefer a rural or an urban backdrop. What I can say is that Yashili signal quite strongly that they support urbanization of the land, provided that the key effects issues they've identified are managed.
Understood. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Ms. Gibb?
No, nothing from me, thank you.
Ms. Tiaho?
Not from me, thank you.
Mr. Fulton?
No, I have no questions. Thank you very much.
Mr. Cooney?
Yes, you're in the light industrial area, are you?
Yeah, the general industrial.
General industrial. Does the Yashili work operate 24 hours a day?
That's a very good question. I do believe they have operations going all day, but I do believe the scale and intensity of the operations is not constant. It would fluctuate throughout the course of the day. That's my understanding.
Yeah, but is it 24 hours a day?
I do believe people are on site working 24 hours a day, and that's from my recollection of my initial briefing. I'm happy to come back to you if that's not correct.
Okay. And the land that HVL's acquired next door, does that slope up? Or is it flat?
It slopes up quite considerably.
Okay. Thank you.
Just following on from Ms. Sedgwick's question, were you here when Hines were presenting their evidence the other day?
No, sir, I wasn't.
A real concern from them, they said, well, look, the noise buffer's the noise buffer, but their big concern was having an industrial facility being overlooked by residential development, which as a consequence would create reverse sensitivity, visual effects and so forth. So that's looking at it the other way, not about what the backdrop ought to be, but from the point of view of having a whole bunch of neighbours saying, you know, I don't like looking at that chimney or that industrial wall, or there's a forklift you know, that seems to drive around at night, I don't know, whatever they may be. Was that not a concern to you when you were doing your review on behalf of Yashili?
No, sir, it wasn't. In my experience, which I provided a rough summary of in the attachment to my evidence.
Yes.
Visual issues haven't been at the fore or even tangential with potential reverse sensitivity issues. That's my own personal experience. I understand why that might be a contention, but perhaps it's one of those things that's easier to mitigate through on-site measures, through the design of buildings and landscaping within a development itself, if there are those concerns. And that potentially could come down to the preference of individual landowners. I think it's perhaps a bigger issue trying to manage noise in particular. And there's direction in the RPS and in the proposed plan at a high level about that very issue, which underscores, I think, the particular focus we've had on that and transport management, safe, efficient operation of Yashili Drive in particular.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Jones. That's very helpful. Thank you for your evidence, and thank you. I think, and we should acknowledge the fact that you've, you know, taken the initiative to go and talk to the planner on the other team, as it were, and you've come up with an agreed solution. And whilst we haven't made any decision on things, certainly where people have liaised and have reached agreement, that to that extent it makes our life a little bit easier. So we're grateful for that.
Happy to help, sir.
Thank you very much. I think that brings Yashili's case to a conclusion. Is that correct, Ms. Manaha?
Yes, it does, sir.
Very good. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Which brings us to Havelock Village, please.
Good morning. I believe we're still on,
Just, no, you got a minute to go.
Excellent. Well, good morning, Chair, and good morning to the panel. I have a number of members of my team here, and some will be joining online. I understand the time constraints today, but we do have a lot of matters to work through, so I'm grateful for your indication that we have some additional time. I would like to take time with the team going through those issues for you, obviously focusing on the outstanding issues.
Thank you.
Now, you'll recall from Monday that there's been a significant focus on the Havelock Buffer interface with the Hines site and the immediate backdrop to the industrial area as well from a cultural perspective. We've heard a lot of overstatements and embellishments from the Hines team on Monday. We've heard them again today from Ms. Simons. And I fully intend to address you on the legal framework around these issues, and I will do so shortly. But this proposal involves more than just an industrial buffer. And so it's also important that the panel is shown more accurate images of that location, but also the site more broadly. So firstly, I'm actually going to hand to Mr. Munro, who I'd like to orient the panel in terms of this proposal and this site in the broader Pokeno context, because he's done that urban design work. And then to Mr. Tolamash, who will explain how the Havelock master planning and precinct plan provisions have been developed to wrap around the site constraints and opportunities. And then I will come back to you and address you on those outstanding issues. So that's just going to require a bit of a seat shuffle, so bear with me for a moment.
Thank you.
Morning, panel.
Morning. No, good afternoon. Missed the morning boat by about 30 seconds, I think.
Always late. Ian Munro here, Mr. Chair, and Mr. Tolmash next to me. We were proposing, just in the interest of time, to just do a bit of a tag team, just to move through things and keep things going, if that's acceptable to you.
You do it in the way that suits you best. I mean, we've made the time. We don't want to shortchange you. So proceed as you wish.
All right, thank you, sir. Yeah, so
what we'll do is we'll share a screen and we will start going through the zone provisions. Can we go back to slide 2, please?
We're sorry to interrupt. We're pretty familiar with this figure, but can you, so it doesn't matter for this one, but it may in the ones that you show subsequently, they're a bit hard to read at that scale.
Yes, I wonder if we zoom in and deal with each part individually.
All right.
What I'd like to do is obviously when we were looking at what is the appropriate framework for the site, we chose deliberately to utilise the existing, as many of the existing provisions of the district plan as possible, as opposed to coming up with a completely new bespoke zone and provisions that was originally suggested in the HVL submission. So the zones being utilised are the residential, the business, the industrial and the rural lifestyle zone, noting that topic 12 recommended to change the name of that from rural countryside living zone to the rural lifestyle. So we've just adopted the section 42A language there. So if we can go through each individual element, and so there's obviously, first of all, there's a number of SNAs already identified in the notified plan through the southern part of the site, but in 5 Hitchin Road, there's a proposal to add that SNA in, which is a large area of native bush not currently identified through the proposed district plan. Another key element, and this gets back to structure planning of the site that Mr. Munro will cover, is we looked at the ways that other structure plans are reflected in the proposed district plan. And Te Kaupata is an obvious example where they've utilised a number of annotations such as indicative roads, such as the environmental protection area, to outline or to directly reflect rules proposed in the plan, but also to outline a framework in terms of certainty about how outcomes would be achieved. The approach of using the EPA, as you see through the site, that's the green areas on the plan, is not just the planting of the land within the industry buffer, but also addressing the nature of existing streams, the areas of wetlands, and also connections through back to areas of SNA. So creating a wider landscape context, but also significant ecological enhancement. To give you an idea of the scale of that there is 46 hectares of EPA proposed around the site. 30 of those hectares is obviously down in the rural lifestyle cluster area, and the remaining relates to the what we call Transmission Hill and its immediate surrounds there. The next element, and you see when you look at the Te Kaupata maps, that structure planning process has established a number of key road linkages and also patterns of development within the site associated with roading connections. And that's deliberately, in my view, to avoid these things being entirely about the future resource consent, but the plan setting a clear direction in terms of connectivity and movement networks within the site. And so they are represented by that more brown dashed line. There is the link from Hitchin Road, if we can point that out, Joel. And there's also the link from Yashili Drive into the site, along with a broad circular road network coming through. One of the elements that was identified as a real opportunity with this site was the connectivity to Bluff Road. Pokeno as a community is actually quite isolated from the river. You have to go down State Highway 1 to the Mercer interchange to get any interaction and interface. And we saw that that was an opportunity of a large site that was contiguous not only with the township, but also was connected through to Bluff Road, was to obviously connect that community on Bluff Road, but also connect Pokeno back down to the river. So those provisions are there. Now, one of the elements of the rules that we've proposed is that that road would need to be formed with the first subdivisions. So it's not a nice to have end product. It is actually a necessity to achieve, and it's tied to the initial subdivisions.
Before you move on, Mr. Tolmash, Mr. Chair, just so you and the panel can have some comfort, all of the indicative roads you see there, we've walked and we've visited them. We've looked at the outside of the site from all the existing zones and actually taken the time to understand, could a solution be found here, yes or no, what would be involved in it? Yes, as is common, and as you heard from the previous submitter, not everything that exists has been gold plated and set up for the next person to come along and connect to, but that doesn't mean that it can't be. And so I hope you take confidence that you're not just looking at a series of dots drawn on a plan that superficially might make sense. Everything here has been visited and checked out and inspected.
Yeah, and just to add to that, that's why in terms of the approach that we've taken to drafting the rules themselves, these elements are all linked to rules. This is not a concept drawing that sits in an appendix somewhere else in the plan that has a tangential reference to. The proposals, each of these elements is tied to rules that are within the precinct rules proposed by Havelock, or within rules that already exist in the notified version of the proposed plan. Another element that obviously the proposed plan addresses is the opportunities for cycle and walking connections. And I think you will recognise that in Pokeno, there's a large quantity of paper roads throughout Pokeno, and these reflected historic trails. They've reflected routes that may have been taken prior to the construction of Great South Road themselves. And one key one that we're proposing would be set up as a trail network is associated with the rural lifestyle area. So that's the black and yellow dots through there, following a number of paper roads to create connections, cycle and pedestrian connections from the from Transmission Hill itself through to Bluff Road to provide those opportunities. Now the actual routes through there are all currently on farm tracks. So there is actually a network of farm tracks already on top of those paper roads. Now, there are a number of provisions which are new and proposed through the rules that are suggested in terms of Havelock. The first, obviously, is the use of a precinct plan as a specific methodology, and whether we call it a precinct plan or a structure plan, it is the same outcome in respect to the site. Now, Mr. Jones has outlined in quite a considerable level of detail for you how the industry buffer would work, and that's going to be addressed further in terms of by each expert on behalf of Havelock. So what you have there in the blue dashed line, the hatch line there, is the proposed industry buffer. Adjoining Yashili, that is proposed to be a light industry zone, and there's specific methods to set up an acoustic barrier associated with either a structural building to provide the attenuation. In the other parts of the site, where you've got the green EPA there, that is land that's considerably steep, even up to 1 and 2, 1 and 1 slopes through that area of land. And that does spill through to the Sinlay site itself. That land is inappropriate for residential development. The proposal is to, and I'll go to a series of photos next to illustrate spatially where that sits. But that's the area that's proposed as EPA. There would be specific rules around the planting, maintenance, and legal obligations associated with the protection of that area. That's also, as Mr. Jones outlined, an area where it is a non-complying activity to establish residential development. So the proposal of the precinct plan is not only to have the industry buffer there, but also to actually have a very specific purpose to that land in respect to how that industry buffer sits as the backdrop to Pokeno itself. And I'm wondering on that, Joel, if we can go to the first photo. Now, if I can just orient you. So we're actually in the Hellensley block. We're up at the Hilltop Reserve. That's in the Hellensley block looking into the site. Now this photo predates the construction of Sinlay. You can see the crane, construction crane there. Now, just in terms of orientation now, Mr. Lambert talked about the hedgerow that runs from Transmission Hill down to the site. So you can see the transmission towers there, and then the hedgerow. Now the property boundary for the site is above the gorse line there, which is in through there. So there's actually a vertical escarpment within the Sinlay land, which is basically a basalt cliff there, and then it rolls over the hill. The EPA would effectively, in the Hilltop Park, relate to all the land to my left, or the left of that image, through there in terms of providing a backdrop. Now, the next, this image doesn't actually assist that great in terms of looking at the other EPA areas. But just to note, in terms of there's Transmission Hill, obviously, but there's also Potters Hill is that high point there. And the provisions that were circulated yesterday not only deal with Transmission Hill, but also deal with establishing a Hilltop Park associated with Potters Hill. And I'll show that when we go back to the precinct plan itself. That SNA that we had previously identified is on the right-hand side of the page where there is the dark vegetation there. So that's an area that would be planted and enhanced. And immediately to the right of that, where you have the green grass, is actually the edge of the current Graham block, the Dines Plan Change 21 subdivision. So through that green area there is actually residential zone in the operative plan and proposed in the proposed plan. To the far right, you can see the water tower, which gives you that visual reference of effectively the edge of the current urban zoning. If we can go to the next image, Joel. Now this is from Mr. Lambert's evidence, and it's just having that effectively that same image through there. What I'd like to point out in terms of this one, obviously also you've got the Sinlay building there, but there is the area of gorse in right of centre of the page there. That's where the extent of half of it is the extent of where the EPA extends as it rolls from Transmission Hill up to the next ridge line there, the next knob through that landform. And the face that you actually see through there, where the darker area is and the gorse is, Joel, can you take the cursor down? That is where one of the slope residential areas is identified in the precinct. If we can go here. And obviously on this one also just pointing out again where Potters Hill sits there, and then Transmission Hill where that sits. Now the next slide, now that's taken from the corner of McDonald and McRobbie inside the Gateway Park industrial area. So to the left is the Hines site, and that is the heavy industry. To the right of the road is where you enter into the light industry zone. What I'd like to highlight there, and this gets to the issue of how the approach of the team has been to highlighting features of importance associated with Pokeno, or notable features, is when you look at Transmission Hill there, and the face that you can see, that face would be, the actual face of the hill would be predominantly within the environmental protection area. So that would be planted and enhanced, and it is only the houses that would roll over that landform, as you see from that angle. And similarly, in terms of the second ridge line, if you can point that out, Joel, that face is also the face that would be within the environmental protection area. So a significant level of enhancement. To give you an idea of scale of that, that's 9.3 hectares of land within that specific environmental protection area that would be undevelopable and would be enhanced with plantings. Now, did we have another slide up? No, that was, so if we can go back to the precinct provisions.
So what, while Mark's looking up that, Mr. Chair, what we were trying to just take you through there with the proposal and giving you a sense of that backdrop to the industrial area and Transmission Hill was really following on from a point I made to you yesterday when I appeared for Pokeno West Limited, and it was about RL 100 and what is a rural backdrop and is it a hard line in the sand, and I described it as perhaps more of a patchwork quilt of saying what are the important bits that really are iconic, and that's why for me the idea of being able to get almost the entirety of that face of the hill all the way up Transmission Hill to the top of it is much more meaningful at trying to capture some retention of that backdrop than just arbitrarily the very, very top of the hair above RL 100. And so that's just hopefully a bit more of a visual context of the principle I was saying yesterday as we've tried to carry it through.
Yeah. So Joel, if we can go back to the precinct plan. So, and zoom in again, thank you. So there's the matter of the hilltop parks. So as proposed in the original evidence, there was the hilltop park associated with Transmission Hill, and that is effectively that face of the hill towards Pokeno. As a response to Mr. Mead, we've proposed an additional hilltop park associated with Potters Hill. Now with Potters Hill is a little bit different, that the paper road that you see running east-west, the actual highest point of the Potters Hill is actually on the paper road. Now that is actually, it's actually formed, it's a gravel road through to the property boundary. So what that feature there is the downward slope, because obviously the road is the road, and then the southern slope of that is in the rural zone and covered by the SNA on the adjoining site. Now next door to that is the proposed neighbourhood centre. That's 3,500 metres. That's for local convenience needs and obviously connected well in terms of that transport network itself. If we can go down to the rural lifestyle cluster itself, Joel. One of the things that we identify, and I've covered this in my evidence, is the current rural lifestyle zone is very much what I call a slice and dice approach. It's minimum lot sizes that are checkerboard across the landform, which I think works well when you have flat sites without any topography or other intervening features. This area does have slope. It does have native bush. It does have areas that would be better utilised for environmental enhancement and expansion of those SNAs themselves. So the proposal here is to establish a specific cluster set of rules. They're in the evidence, which equate to 55 dwellings identified in clusters with the requirement for planting associated with those EPA areas, the green areas, and the continuation of that road through to Bluff Road as part of the subdivision proposal itself. I think different from what you've heard with other witnesses, where they're focused on a structure plan as a non-statutory document or an information document. This proposal is very much all those annotations on that plan are connected to rules, are connected to discretions. So that, for example, the matter of the EPA that was raised yesterday by Commissioner Cooney around the legal protection mechanisms, both myself and Mr. Mead have looked at that in detail, and we've suggested additional discretions to create the level of certainty that the outcomes illustrated would be achieved, how they've been managed, how they would be, what the ownership arrangements would be. I think part of that's a recognition that there are some standards in the notified plan that could be drafted a little bit better. they might be missing some of the teeth that have been discussed in the last couple of days of this hearing. And I originally recognised that in terms of drafting the provisions. And it's one of the reasons why we've proposed a specific set of rules for the Havelock precinct itself. And obviously also utilise those rules that we consider appropriate from the operative plan in the same way that they've been utilised in Te Kauwhātua. Now, in terms of, I think, can we go to one question that's been raised, and I think this is important clarification, is what is the zones under the operative district plan and where are they located? And we'll address this further in terms of presentation of the evidence. So this is the operative district plan. The red line is the land owned by Havelock Village. The bluey grey colour is the aggregate extraction and processing zone. So this is the original Whinstone quarry. Now you can see spatially how that obviously covers, as Mr. Hines related to you, it covers the Hines land to the east, and then it covers Transmission Hill itself. It does not cover the land in 5 Hitchin Road, which was somewhat a rural orphan left over after the Pokeno structure plan work in terms of Plan Change 24. And also it was land not owned by Whinstone in respect to the quarry itself. So that gives you an idea of like that spatial extent of what the plan envisaged, which if we can just point out, Joel, the southern extent of the hill is, so where the road, paper road is, Joel, Potter's Road, paper road, that is effectively, if that is the top of what I call, you know, the Transmission Hill feature itself. Once you go south of that, that goes downhill itself. So you're going from RL 90 there down to about, I'd say RL 20 in terms of the topography through that part of the site. Effectively, this is a very ancient volcanic feature, is the hill itself. That was the reason why Whinstone investigated this as a quarry. And the reason obviously why at the time it was included in the aggregate extraction and processing zone. What I note out of that, and this is probably this indication of, at the time of the Pokeno structure plan, this quarry zone was in place. The quarry zone had discretions associated with landscaping and screening, but not landscape features generally. It only sought the protection of ONFs and ONLs, and none are identified in the operative district plan on the site. It also had discretions associated with archaeological features. And that's the way it addressed the broader issues of landscape effects from a quarry and obviously matters associated with Heritage New Zealand in terms of archaeological finds. Now, another matter spatially, Joel, if we can go to the distances plan. So another matter that's been raised is effectively this idea of an unconstrained industrial area. And in my evidence, I outlined what could actually occur inside the zones and inside the zones directly adjacent to the Hines site, for example. And what you see there is the distances in my evidence in respect to where activities in the business zone, for example, apartments above the shop, can be established. The activity itself as a permitted activity, the buildings as a restricted discretionary activity, also identifies where the closest residential zones are. These are existing constraints. They existed at the time of Plan Change 24, and these are activities that are significantly closer to the Hines site, for example, than the HVL site. And if you can go to the next slide, Joel, with the distances to. Now this slide, I think, illustrates the separation distances between the Hines buildings, existing development, and the Hines property boundary, and the outer extent of the industry buffer. And these range from 470 metres from the boundary through to 677 metres at their furthest. So comparing that, obviously, where we had permitted apartments being able to be developed in the business zone, 70 metres away from the Hines site, there are existing constraints, and the evidence from the individual expert witnesses will articulate that more. And I thought that that context drawing was quite important to understand the site as a whole.
Well, is it? Is that determinative of reverse sensitivity issues that you face on the other side? Just because they're potentially closer doesn't really answer the question on the other side, does it?
It doesn't, but Mr. Stiles will outline that these are existing constraints, and he'll take you through that in more detail.
But having constraints on one side doesn't justify putting further constraints on, does it?
That is where the industry buffer that is proposed is the response in terms of the areas of land that is constrained in respect to noise, odour, lighting. And that's where the expert advice sits in terms of areas where residential development should not occur, because it would be exposed, for example, to unreasonable levels of noise, and beyond that, where they would be exposed to an oral environment which is consistent with many existing urban environments.
Okay, can we quickly just go to the, I think it's slide 3. And then just, Mr. Chair, just to take you in a bit more, well, a very summary fashion, a bit more detail of what's actually been drawn and how it arrived there based on some of the things Mr. Tolmash has just told you. And so this is quite different from the work that was filed in the original submission, which was prepared by Construct Limited. And it came about largely starting with Mr. Tolmash and I, but then encompassing all of the other expert witnesses on the team, starting to read through the RPS and the PDP and what kind of built form outcomes it was seeking, and what we thought that meant, and purely as a way of confirming the approach I've taken, which I think you could interpret as a form of assumption that's guided my analysis and conclusions, has been that this idea of the compact urban form and making everyone's life easier and joined up and more convenient kind of wins, except for ONLs, ONFs, identified constraints, environmental barriers, etc. And so it made a lot of sense to me, especially when it was identified that connections not just to Cole and Hitchin but to Yashili were possible, to really make the most of land that is, I think, very close and within a 10-minute walk of a lot of jobs. And I say that because a lot of the people that live in this area, were it zoned, would have just as much opportunity to work in the adjacent industrial zone as the people in existing zones that might have laid a claim to it that I don't think exists in fact. It's also very accessible to the town centre, especially if one takes a creative look at a recent idea called a 15-minute city, or the idea that people will very quickly move towards e-scooters, e-bikes, those very, very efficient and sustainable modes, and really expand where they can travel in 5 or 10 minutes without using the proverbial car. And when I looked at all the other areas identified for growth just in the Waikato 2070 strategy, accepting that lots of other submitters to this process have identified other bits of land, this stood out as one of the closest and most connected to those features, and which could really meet those RPS aspirations. And so I was keen to see this used as efficiently as possible. Now, there are a lot of constraints, as Mr. Tolmash and others have pointed out, to do with slope, visual sensitivity. What we all agree is the important retention of a key part of that rural backdrop, being certainly the slope up to Transmission Hill. And what you see indicated, and it's been carried forwards into the precinct plan, is a as direct and connected as possible internal road network based on actual blocks that can achieve all the subdivision outcomes the PDP seeks, so lots oriented to solar access, opportunity for dwellings to connect visually with streets, so they're pleasant to walk along and be in, protection of the streams and their corridors, and you see that through that plan too. And you'll see the non-linear shape of the streets reflecting, that's the underlying contour. And that's what I'd expect to see based on the idea of trying to think about development working with the landform, not as sort of the 1800s era of an English surveyor drawing a rectilinear grid, then dropping it on the top of a hill. And that's why that's come about the way it's come about. Now, can we just pan down to the south, please, Joel? When we look at the southern bulb of the site, that the original submission, sir, proposed that for urban residential as well. And it was largely through Mr. Tolnash and I reading the RPS and asking ourselves, would that actually be a compact urban form? Would it connect directly to Pokeno? Our view was that it wouldn't. And through a process of still wanting to try and secure that, I think, very strategically helpful road linkage down to Bluff and trying to connect the river and Pokeno without needing to go via the highway, we started on a process that led to where we did. What I want to say, sir, and I'm going to go off script a little bit, and the team doesn't know I'm going to say this, so if the screen cuts out suddenly, maybe you could send a search party for me. You and I had a discussion yesterday, and you put to me, well, what if the ridges were protected, but residential was provided on the western side of them? That is effectively what Construct proposed in the original submission in this lower bowl. And although it doesn't appeal to me, and I don't favour it as part of what I'm reading, the RPS is seeking from the growth of towns like Pokeno, were the panel to find itself in a situation along the lines of the proposition you put to me yesterday, where you think maybe Pokeno can accommodate growth over the top of those ridges and down to them, well, that original submission, as I understand it, hasn't been withdrawn, sir, and you may well find yourself in a position where you could revisit what's appropriate on this lower bulb. It would fit in very well with what you put to me, albeit as a hypothetical, sir, and not an actual option. But although I don't favour it, I think it would be remiss of me not to at least identify it to you. It's effectively in line with what you said. But for the reasons I've given in my evidence, my recommendation is that it shouldn't be urban residential for the same shortcomings that I'm not favoured for Pokeno East. And that's because I don't think the RPS says put dwellings on low topography, landscape sprawl, make them compact, and that necessarily does involve some hard trade-offs. But in terms, sir, of just giving you an overview of how we've got to where we've got to and why what's in front of you is where it's at, I think we can wrap that up now. And I think the intention is after submissions, individual witnesses, including Mr. Tolnash and I, come back more fulsomely. And so, for instance, I've got a few comments to make about some of the structure plan that the alleged benefits did have put to you, and my own views about that too. We'll come back to that later. Just so you know, that's the plan, to not just end it right now with us.
All right. The panel want to ask any questions at this point, or shall we leave it till we hear from the individual witnesses in more detail later on?
Just one, in case I forget it. Could you throw up that coloured map? I think it was the operative plan that showed the aggregate area. Yeah, that one. Yeah. Winston's never, it operated its quarry there, but where did it operate its quarry in relation to the land there that's zoned aggregate?
So Winston never commenced operations on the site. They brought the site on a large amount of land. They sought a resource consent in 1998. They sought prior to that zoning, obviously, and they followed the Plan Change 14 process, for example. In 2005, they let that consent lapse, and that was obviously came from the Environment Court, that consent. So Winston never started, and I've included in my evidence in chief a letter from Winston regarding that it became impractical economically and also in respect to access to actually undertake the quarry on the site. And so they didn't pursue it further. It went to market. No other quarry operator sought to purchase the site.
And they surrendered their consent when? 2005, was it?
It lapsed in 2005.
Okay. do you know what that consent enabled them to do in terms of the ridge lines and things?
So, so prior to Plan Change 24, I viewed those maps. Obviously, part of the land that's now heavy industry was within the aggregate processing zone. They were looking to utilise the land where that heavy industry is now as their major processing facility. So they'd need to actually create effectively a portal or the pit design through the hill from the north, effectively going in a south west direction through the hill and around into the basalt itself. And the basalt is not uniformly equal in the site. It's more in a giant U shape. So that would involve a reasonable level of modification to the face that you'd see from the industrial areas and from the Pokeno Main Street in terms of that quarry and the pit design, effectively a series of benched batters. It did propose to keep effectively what is more on the northeastern flank, obviously adjoining the Five Hitchin Road, and to keep that portion of the landform. So it was effectively chasing the rock itself, and it did need to affect that drop.
Okay, but the nub of it was from 2005, the land just sat there and there were no consents associated with excavating the land, and by the time the 217 structure plan came in, it was almost a frozen site, as it were. Is that
so? Plan Change 24 was very explicit in terms of that when it was proposed in maintaining the opportunity for the quarry, and that was very much part of the thinking in terms of the Pokeno structure plan. So that was included as a significant constraint that there would be a quarry there. There were a large set of effectively reverse sensitivity controls associated with Plan Change 24 in favour of the quarry. That includes transport routes through the main street for the trucks to exit the quarry site. So Windstone very much were part of the Plan Change 24 process. They owned the land at that time, and they were still preserving that opportunity for a quarry.
okay? Thank you.
Mr. Chair, I do have a question, but I'm happy to wait till after lunch.
That's fine.
To see that photograph again, and just if they could point out where the cultural significant sites were that Mr. Flavel pointed out and the other team pointed out yesterday. Oh, okay. So just the signal station that was referred to, where would that be in the photograph?
So the Clough report indicates that it's probable that the signal station could be within the site, but there is no definitive evidence of that, and there's been site investigations done to try to prove that. They interpolate that could have been on Transmission Hill, at the top of Transmission Hill where the cell phone towers are, or on Potter's Hill, or it could have been off the site entirely. But they're saying the reasonable probability is it could have been either of one of those two hills. And if I can go back to our precinct plan, and I'll just point out the actual par features that were. Could you zoom straight out, all the way out, please?
All the way
out. No, zoom all the way out. Keep going, please. So down in the bottom corner of the site, there's the two purple outlines. They are to par. The more triangle-shaped one is Te Whero's provisions part that was established with the invasion. I've personally spent a lot of time with Mr. Flavel Ms. Rutherford, others, and we've actually been exploring what is, given the difficulty with available published material, what is the information and how do we translate that to the land form itself. So the actual 2 pa were down there, and the signal station could have been at either one of where the hilltop reserves is proposed there. Ian Lawler did the site investigations at the time of the Windstone original consent and could not find any visual evidence of the signal station itself. Now, obviously, that does not mean that there's subsurface in terms of that, and that was noted in the archaeology report.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Tolamash.
Thank you both. That's been very helpful. Let's break for lunch and we'll resume again at 1:15, please. Be aware that you'll need to log off from this call, and the council website, if you don't have the link already, has a link to this afternoon session. But if the panel wouldn't mind waiting at the conclusion of this session just for a moment, please. So thanks, we'll adjourn to 1:15.